To understand the moon in the first house, let's begin with a quick review of what the moon symbolizes and what the first house symbolizes. Then we can get into the theory of what the moon in the first house represents, how you would interpret it. Then we'll put that theory into practice on 4 actual charts and see how it actually works in real cases. And we'll use the charts of famous people: Krishna, Rama, Oprah, and Priyanka. So let's start off with a review of the first house. You can see here what the first house physically is. The first house is literally the area of sky around the eastern horizon. And the eastern horizon is what? It's where the sun rises. That's the root of everything the first house represents. Sunrise has to do with beginnings. So the first house represents the beginning of the thing that's being described by the chart. So let's say your birth. The beginning of what? The birth of what? The birth of your body. And what does the body do? It establishes and reinforces a center for our sense of self. The sunrise also represents things becoming visible. So it's all about things becoming more manifest, more expressed, and more tangible. And hence it represents the traits, the real qualities of a thing. What it looks like, what it tastes like, what it smells like, what it acts like, etc. Now let's have a review of what the moon represents. It's a little bit more complicated than the first house. Think about the moon. What are 3 obvious characteristics about it? It comes out at night. It's very, very bright. And it changes a lot. Those are the 3 foundations of what the moon represents. So let's talk first about the fact that it is the planet which dominates the night compared to the sun which dominates the day. The night is what compared to the day? It's private, it's unseen. The day is public, you go out and you see things. The night is private, you stay inside and you don't see things. So the night has to do with unseen things, and that's why the moon represents privacy, private things. It has a shyness to it. It's about personal things. Things which you don't necessarily share with others. It's about domestic things or things which happen inside a private space. And hence the moon is a feminine planet and represents feminine things because the female sex organs are unseen. They go in compared to the male sex organs which are seen. They come out. Now to evolve the concept of the night being unseen a little bit, unseen things exist but they're not seen. That means they are internal. They're on the inner part of something beyond what you see, right? So because the moon dominates the night, it has to do with things which are unseen, which means it has to do with things which are below the surface or internal. This is why the moon symbolizes the mind, and it's probably the most important thing to understand about the moon. By the mind, we don't mean the part of you that gets tested on an IQ test. That's a separate thing, that's intellect, and that's Mercury. Mind means what we often call your heart, where you experience life, what you feel, etc. And this is why the moon is the planet of emotions, because emotions are the currency of the mind. And furthermore, the root cause of emotion is desire. We feel happy or sad based on whether we fulfill or don't fulfill desires. And so the moon has to do with our desires, and desires are based on opinions. We want what we think is good and we don't want what we think is bad. So the moon has to do with opinions, subjectivity, and bias. Now all of that symbolism is simply because of the basic fact that the moon comes out at night and it's very prominent at night. Now let's look at some important symbolism derived from the fact that the moon is super bright compared to anything else that's out at night. So this is why the moon symbolizes beauty, something which is eye-catching, stunning. And this is also why the moon represents authority. Like the sun and moon represent authority figures. But the sun represents masculine archetype authorities, and the moon represents feminine archetype authorities. So, like archetypically, well, who's that? Mom, compared to the sun, who's dad. Finally, let's derive some meaning from the fact that the moon changes a lot, and that is simply that the moon represents change or flux, cyclic change. So things having a rhythm or pulse and things being fluid. Now that we understand clearly the moon and the first house, we can put them together and dive into the subject of what happens when the moon goes into the first house. There's a pretty big issue here, is that the first house is about sunrise, but the moon is about the night. And so the first house has to do with things becoming more visible and more seen, and the moon has to do with things becoming less visible, more hidden, more private. And that also comes to do with the privacy of the moon versus the manifestability of the first house, and also the fact that the moon is the mind, whereas the first house is the body. And so we can derive an interpretation of the moon in the first house from this basic fact. And that interpretation is, if you have the moon in the first house, you have a complex way of manifesting yourself. It's not an obvious, simple way that you express, show, and manifest your being. It will be difficult to understand your emotions, for example, as an observer watching your behavior. You may have completely different emotions than what you're showing. Conversely, it may be difficult for you to figure out a way to express your actual emotions. So there's this complexity between the hidden thing and the manifest thing, where the manifest thing, there's like a disconnect between the two. So the moon and the first house kind of conflict in the sense that the moon is very private, but the first house is very visible. However, the moon is also very bright. This is what makes the moon very complex itself. It's the nighttime planet, but it's super bright. So we have to, at the same time, consider the fact that the moon and the first house get along, in that the moon is bright, and the first house likes bright things because it's the sunrise. So this also has to do with the fact that the moon represents the mother and the first house represents the body. And if you know a little bit about metaphysics, you might know that actually the mind is the mother of the body. So maybe it's not a hard dichotomy, body-mind, because also it's mother-child. And they're in harmony on that topic, but they're out of harmony on the topic of private-public. So it's quite complex. And the important interpretation to bring forth from the harmony between the moon and the first house is that this person is well nourished. Like symbolically speaking, the mother takes care of this child, the moon in the first house. So the person gets good food. They get a lot of food. They eat well. Therefore they're strong. Therefore they look good. They're beautiful. Their body is healthy. They're beautiful. They get support. They have a mom, let's say, symbolically speaking. So they get support. So the result is they're physically strong, they're physically attractive, and they're emotionally strong and confident. Now that's a very clear theory of what the moon in the first house represents, or how you would interpret the moon in the first house. But until you really look at it in actual charts, the nuances and the reality of it won't really become too evident. So let's take the time to look at least 4 charts. We have Krishna, Rama, Oprah, and Priyanka Chopra. We'll start off with Krishna. So the dichotomy between the moon and the first house is manifest versus not manifest. Does that make sense with Krishna? Yes, very much. He's Param Brahman as a person. Brahman is this abstract, undefinable basis of reality, consciousness in an abstract form. But this is Krishna, an actual person with eyes, ears, nose, mouth, a defined person with a body, a manifest person, a manifestation of the unmanifest thing. And the second thing about the moon in the first house is the harmony between them, producing a person that's very beautiful and very confident. Is that Krishna? For sure, that's his trademark. That's what makes the manifestation versus unmanifestation so dramatic. It's not just a typical manifestation. This is the apex of physical beauty and sensual enjoyment. So what's going on with this chart? If you look at the moon in the first house, you'll notice that it's in Taurus. That means it's exalted. So whenever you have a planet exalted in a house, you should downplay the negative possibilities and upplay the positive. Upplay the beautiful and confident interpretation, and we would downplay a complexity of manifest versus not manifest, but kind of spin it into a positivity. So we wouldn't say Krishna has a hard time expressing his emotions, which we might say of somebody else with the moon in the first house. But we would say Krishna is very difficult to understand just by looking at him. On top of that, you'll notice that right next to his moon is Ketu. Ketu itself also represents invisible and unmanifest and internal. So you have a harmony between Ketu and the moon entering the first house. Like Ketu is harmonious with the moon in the sense that they both withdraw. And they both are internal and unseen. So, in other words, the fact that his moon is with Ketu also helps put a positive spin on the manifest versus unmanifest dichotomy between the moon and the first house, because Ketu is on the moon's side of favoring the unmanifest. So you wouldn't think, here's a person who loses themselves by trying to express themselves to the world, or gets confused about themselves by trying to express themselves to the world. Rather, you would think, here's a person who the world cannot understand. Even when this person comes right in front of their face and says, hi, I'm XYZ, they won't understand and they'll think he's ABC. One final thing that's very important about this chart, if you're going to interpret a planet in a house, you should always think about the nature of the house itself. So in other words, you should really look at the lord of the house. So since we're interpreting the moon in the first house, we would want to know about the first lord. His first lord is in a Raja Yoga with the 9th and the 10th lord, Saturn, in its own sign, Libra. So it's in a fantastic Raja Yoga. So that is going to do the same exact thing. It's going to mean this person has a lot of self, very strong self. They're not confused about themselves as it might be with somebody else's chart with the moon in the first house. Let's take a look now at Ramchandra's chart. So, manifest versus unmanifest, again, yes, because he's a Vishnu avatar, so he's Brahman in a tangible form. Brahman is supposed to be intangible. But it's not as dramatic as Krishna. Because Krishna isn't just Brahman in a tangible form. Krishna is Brahman like as the most tangible form, the most beautiful, the most sensual, the most magnificent. Where Rama is more about his actions and his duties rather than his actual form. Is Rama, however, beautiful and confident? Super, of course. But again, compared to Krishna, it's actually a little bit more on the confidence thing and a little bit less on the beauty. Ram is the avatar of Krishna as a king, showing dharma and how to be a king and follow principles and morals and things like that. So it's his emphasis is more on the confidence and a little less on the beauty, although they're both super high off the charts. So having a look at his chart, his moon is not in Taurus like Krishna's. His moon is in Cancer. So that means his moon is domicile. So again, it's in a very good dignity, and then that also takes care of the first lord, but that means the first lord is in the first house. So his first house is doing great, but it's not as dramatic. It's more stabilized than Krishna's. Exaltation is more of a dramatic thing, and domicile is more of a stabilizing thing. Furthermore, his first lord is also in a Raj Yoga like Krishna's, but right there in the first house with Jupiter. That explains Ram. So this protects the seen-unseen dichotomy against any kind of deception. Right? The moon in the first house could be very deceptive. It's not showing what it really is. It's hiding what it really is. So a person can be very good at telling lies, for example. And Krishna is really on that theme. Very deceptive, tricky, very playful. But Ram is not. That's because Krishna's moon in the first house is with Ketu and exalted, while Ram's is with Jupiter exalted. Now, coming to more conventional people, how about Oprah Winfrey? Oprah Winfrey, how does that manifest versus unmanifest dichotomy work out for her? You can see it actually. Now it gives it a more concrete sense. It becomes a little bit less of an amorphous idea what that means. Because Oprah Winfrey is extremely famous, yes, but why? She's extremely famous for giving other people the spotlight. She ran or runs a talk show where it's her guests that she brings on that are really the focus, and she's the facilitator of it. So she's getting fame by taking herself out of center stage. That's very illustrative of the complexity of the moon in the first house and the dichotomy of manifesting, becoming famous, becoming visible, but not manifesting. Is Oprah beautiful and confident? I say yes to both, especially in the confidence thing. Taking a look at her chart, it also looks quite special. Her moon is in Sagittarius in the first house, so let's look at the first lord. The first lord is Jupiter. Jupiter is opposite. It's out there in Gemini, so the first lord is aspecting the first house and the moon in the first house. So the first house again is getting more stabilized, more confident. You're going to bring out the positive spins of the interpretation rather than the potential negative spins. The other thing is the only thing in the Kendra, or the central houses, those pink squares in the middle, the only thing is the moon and the first lord. So the person is very, very self-reliant. And the person is actually very, very visible and famous because the only thing that's in the center stage of her chart is the moon in the first house and her first lord. And the first lord is in the seventh house, which also describes a person that has fame by giving fame to others. And finally, let's have a look at the chart of Priyanka Chopra. Manifest versus not manifest. Here's another way that it becomes very real. Finally, when you see it in a real person, she's an actress. So she's not famous for being Priyanka Chopra. She's famous for the roles that she played. Of course, it's her playing the role, but you can see that kind of complexity. Who's famous? The character in the movie or Priyanka? She's not showing her real self. She's playing a different person. But that person is highly, highly visible. It's on a movie screen somewhere. It's broadcast to people's television sets and so forth. So moon in first house is a good candidate for somebody like an actor or an actress, especially if it's in an artistic sign like Gemini, which this is in her case. Is she beautiful and confident? Super. Extremely, extremely both confident and extremely beautiful. So what's going on in her chart? First of all, look, the moon is in the first house with Venus. So you have the two female planets, you have the two beautiful planets in the first house. So that's really going to enhance the beauty interpretation. It's also in a good sign for beauty, Gemini, which is in general just good for beauty, attractiveness, likability, and mutability, actually, changeability. So it's very good for an actress, a famous actress, a beautiful actress. One other thing you want to look at is where's the first lord? And you find out the first lord is in Cancer, and then that should all of a sudden ring a bell because the moon is the lord of Cancer. We have an exchange between the first house and the second house. This is going to help all the interpretations and not put a negative spin on any of the interpretations. Especially, it's going to give some solidity and a lot of health and beauty. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. The moon in the second house is a very interesting placement. And to understand it, we should begin by reviewing what the second house represents. Here it is. The second house is the area of sky that is directly below the eastern horizon. That's the basis for everything that it symbolizes. It's below the eastern horizon, so it symbolizes everything that supports whatever the eastern horizon represents. What happens in the east? The sun rises. So the second house supports sunrise. What is sunrise all about? Sunrise is the start of the day. So supporting the sunrise means supporting the start of things, supporting the birth of things, supporting the creation of things. This is why it is the house of foundations. The support of the building is its foundation. The thing that something else is built upon is the second house. And the thing that you build something else upon really affects the stability of the thing that you build. And that's why the second house is very crucial for understanding the stability of things. If you ask yourself, what am I built upon? Practically, you would probably, hopefully, remember your mom. Because you come from your mom, right? So this is what the second house represents: your parents and your family. Not only are you're the foundation of your birth, but also they're the people that support you. So the second house has to do with the family and all sorts of supporters and friends. And you may also think, what allows me to perform any of the endeavors that I want to do? Then you would probably remember your wallet or your bank account. And so the second house represents wealth as well. All of the assets that we have that enable us to do other things, including our health. Now, when the sun rises, it starts the day, and what happens? Things come to light. We see things more clearly when the sun comes out. So the second house, therefore, is pro-visibility in everything that it represents. This is why it's a house of knowledge. Knowledge means increasing your awareness of what you're seeing. And this is why it's the house of realism and practicality, because it likes things that become more clear, more realistic, more tangible, more definable. That is a good summary of what the second house represents. Before we move on and talk about what the moon represents in the second house, let us first quickly review what the moon represents. When we think of the moon, we think of three qualities. It comes out at night. It's the king of the nighttime world. It's very bright compared to the night, which makes it very complicated because it's a night planet, but bright. And that is also its third quality, is that it is dichotomous or changing or fluid. It's not really one thing or the other. Is it bright or is it night? Well, it's kind of both. So it's night, bright, and changing. These three are the basic things that all of the symbolism of the moon is based upon. So because the moon is so changeable and fluid, it is the planet which symbolizes fluctuation, cycles, rhythms. And because the moon is so bright, it's the planet that represents beauty. Now, because it's the planet of night, the moon therefore has to do with things which are not seen, which seems at odds with the fact that it's bright. But this means it illuminates the things which are unseen. That's the nature of the moon. So it has to do with private things that we experience, but we experience them in private. So the moon has a shy quality to it. It has a personal quality to it. Things that are not exposed to the whole world. Things that are kept private or personal. Things that are domestic within the home. And therefore the moon's nature is feminine, because feminine nature is internal. The sexual organ of the female goes in. Now, on that theme of unseen being equal to internal, the moon, being the planet of the night, also represents things which are internal. It's not unreal, but it's internal. And so the internal aspect of our self, which is our mind, not exactly the intellectual functions within ourselves, but our emotional functions. So the moon is the planet of emotions, and our emotions are based on whether or not we are fulfilling our desires. So the moon represents desires, and our desires are based on our opinions. What we think is good, what we think is bad, what we think is desirable and undesirable. So the moon is the planet of opinions, and this is why it's a subjective, biased planet. One final thing about the moon, which is very interesting. It's nighttimey, so it's internal and unseen, so it's feminine, but it's bright. So feminine brightness is beauty, but also brightness indicates authority or dominance over other things. So the moon also represents authority and dominance, but in a feminine way. So it represents the female authority, which is archetypically described as the mother. Now that we took the time to review what the moon and the second house represents, we can put them both on the same page and figure out what the moon symbolizes when it goes into the second house. So first of all, the moon signifies fluctuation and change, but the second house is about foundation and stability. So this is a clash. So if the moon is in the second house, it represents big changes. Changes often happening. Significant changes. Secondly, the moon is all about opinions, which means my subjective viewpoint and my bias. But the second house likes things that are objectively clear. So the moon is subjective and the second house is objective, and that's a clash. So when the moon is in the second house, we get people who their objective world is very subjective. So they get into fantasies, they get very into imagination. They get very bored by practical things, or they have low regard for tangible things. Thirdly, the moon is the unseen night planet, but it's very bright. So it's an unseen bright planet. So it's like unseen, but the second house is about supporting the sunrise, right? So it's pro-visibility. So this is another clash, but it's actually not quite a clash because the moon is also so bright. So it's a very complex relationship. The moon is unseen bright, and the second house likes things that are bright because it likes sunrise. So when the moon is in the second house, people are famous for being invisible, famous for not being too visible, famous for not being too materialistic, etc. Now, let's take this concept of the moon in the second house and compare it with three people with known, documented, well-documented birth times who are well known. With the moon in the second house, René Guénon, Walt Disney, and Sadhguru. So how about on this first thing of changing often and significantly? René Guénon was like a constant changer of religion, always changing his religion. I mean, very dramatically changing religions, sampling from all the religions, fluctuating between them, trying to make them all integrated into one thing. Walt Disney, how does this constant change or these big changes? His childhood is extremely different from his adulthood. And his childhood was very child negative, and his adulthood was very child positive. Sadhguru, very different life before his enlightenment and after his enlightenment. Non-vegetarian, vegetarian, and so forth and so on. So you can see three practical examples of the moon in the second house representing a life that has like constant change or a lot of change or important changes to it. The second point was the clash between subjectivity and objectivity. So the interpretation is these people are really into fantasy or imagination, and they're a little bit bored by conventional material things. René Guénon, super, of course, he's the metaphysics. Metaphysics is his big thing. He always talks about metaphysics and spirituality. He's in his imagination and creativity and bored with conventional worldly things. Walt Disney, imagine, believe. Those are his big slogans. Believe, imagine. Sadhguru, what's his thing? Spirituality, spirituality, spirituality. So again, here you can see three concrete examples of the clash between subjectivity of the moon and objectivity of the second house, producing a person that's not very thrilled with objective things and is way more interested in subjective things, fantasy, illusion, perception, spirituality, so forth, philosophy. The third point, famous for being invisible, or famously invisible, or famous for their invisibility, or famous about things which are not visible, tangible things. We'll get a better concrete idea of this by looking at these three examples. Rene Guénon, what's he famous for? Is he famous for how beautiful his face is? Is he famous for how many cars he has, or how much money he made, or what inventing the light bulb? He's famous for his ideas about spirituality. So he's famous for these intangible things. Walt Disney, what's he famous for? He's famous for creating fantasy stories and fantasy characters and helping people to believe and imagine. What's Sadhguru famous for? Famous for his ideas, famous for his spirituality. So now you get a concrete concept of what we mean by the moon in the second house, indicating a person who is famous for invisible things. Visible for invisible things. But there's something about each one of these three that doesn't really seem to be connected to the moon in the second house, but is quite significant in their individual lives. For example, Rene Guénon is very ill, has very poor health. Walt Disney, he's very wealthy and very artistic. And Sadhguru is very wealthy also and very powerful, like very influential, very dominant, very commanding. But that doesn't seem to have anything to do with this moon in the second house. So let's take a look at their individual charts to see what's going on those topics. Does the moon in the second house play any role whatsoever in the ill health of Rene Guénon? Well, no, actually it should be the opposite. Theoretically, speaking as a theoretical astrologer, we would say no, it should have been the opposite, because the moon represents the mother, the creator of the body, therefore it represents health and beauty, and the second house represents the mother, the father, the creator of the birth. So why should Rene Guénon have terrible health when he has the moon in the second house? Well, first thing I want to bring to your attention is, if something is very important to health, then things which affect it have a direct effect upon health. So since the moon in the second house is pretty important to health, if there are negative effects on that moon, they will directly affect the health. When you talk about health, the areas that draw your attention are the second house, the house of health, the sixth house, the house of illness, the eighth house, the house of our vitality, and the 12th house, the house of our anti-vitality. Right, the house of our fatigue. And the planet representing health is the sun. So let's look at how these factors are playing out in Rene Guénon's chart. He has the 8th Lord in the second house with the second Lord in bad dignity. The second house itself is being affected by the 8th Lord, and the second Lord is also being affected by the 8th Lord, and the 8th Lord is not in a happy condition, because it's in a sign that it doesn't like, with the ruler of that sign that it doesn't like. Secondly is that the 6th Lord aspects that whole thing. The 6th Lord is aspecting the first and second house, and the second Lord. And you might say, but that's exalted 6th Lord, but it's on a very difficult degree. It's in Sandhi. It's on 0 degrees. Finally, when you take a look at the sun is in the house of illness, the 6th house, which could be okay, but it's there with the 12th Lord, the Lord of fatigue. So all things considered, this is the chart of a person who has significant health problems. Is it because they have the moon in the second? Not really. The next question that we had was Walt Disney. Why is he so artistic? Is the moon in the second house artistic? Not necessarily artistic, but the moon in the second house really loves imagination. And now think about Walt Disney. Is he Picasso? He's not Picasso, but he is very good with imagination, and he draws pictures well enough to convey his ideas. So when you think about art, you should draw your attention to these places: the 3rd house, the 5th house, and the 11th house, as well as the moon and Venus. If we look at these in his chart, his moon is in the 2nd house, which we talked about, but what sign is it in? It's in Libra, an artistic sign, Venus's sign. His Venus is where? In the 5th house, an artistic house, and while it is there, it is with the 7th and 4th lords, so it is in Raja Yoga, which means it's very powerful there. So the very artistic planet Venus is in the very artistic 5th house in a very powerful combination. His 1st lord, furthermore, is in the 3rd house, which means he likes to draw, likes to use his hands. And his 3rd lord is in the 5th house, which means he doesn't just like to write or use tools with his hands or play sports with his hands. He likes to do artistic things with his hands. And his 5th lord is in the 5th house, means his 5th house, creative house, is blessed in Raja Yoga. So it is really not hard to see at all that this is a very artistic person that is very imagination driven. So in other words, does the moon in the 2nd house make you very artistic? No, but it makes you very imaginative. And then if you have a chart like Walt Disney where you also are very artistic, then you will express your imagination very effectively through art. Another thing about Walt Disney is that he's was incredibly wealthy. So does the moon in the 2nd house make you incredibly wealthy? It doesn't go against it, right? The moon is about wanting things, and the 2nd is about having things. So wanting plus having equals finding. So, the moon in the 2nd house is not necessarily an indication of wealth, but it's not wealth negative. It's wealth positive, wealth favorable. What are the important points related to wealth? 2nd house and 11th house. Those are the positive indications. And 12th and 6th are negative for wealth. But when it comes to wealth, you just want to see negative meaning outflow or expense, and positive meaning income. But you can't make income without making expense. So even the negative financial houses are positively important in a chart. Anyway, let's look at what he's got. He's got the 1st lord in the 2nd house. Well, the 2nd house is important for wealth, and the 1st lord is the most important lord. But more importantly, the 2nd lord and the 6th lord are both in Raja Yoga. Both of them are in Raja Yoga. So does the moon in the 2nd house make you wealthy? No, but if it's in a chart like this where there's other things that indicate wealth, then certainly the moon in the 2nd house helps. Sadhguru is also very, very wealthy. So for Sadhguru, his 11th lord is in the 11th house with the 1st lord. Oof. And that 11th lord is also the 6th lord. We said the 11th house is important, the 6th house is important. The 11th and the 6th lord are in the 11th house with the 1st lord, making them very important. We said the 2nd house is important for wealth. His moon is in his 2nd house, and his 2nd lord is in his 1st house. We said the 12th and the 2nd lords and houses are very important. So his 12th lord is in 2 Raja Yogas. It's like Walt Disney. Now, Sadhguru has another quality that seems very interesting, is that he's fairly dominant. He's very dominating and commanding. When he walks in, you notice it. And it's not just because people have nominated him to be the guru. He has its natural sense of command. Is that part of what it means to have the moon in the 2nd house? Sort of. The moon in the 2nd house does support being a prominent or a dominant individual. But it isn't really on itself enough to indicate a person who really is very prominent like Sadhguru. So what else is going on? With this quality of being very, very commanding or very dominant, you would look at the 10th house and the sun. So what's going on in his case? Well, he has the 10th lord in the 10th house with the 9th lord and the 5th lord. So he's got two Raja Yogas in his 10th house with the 10th Lord in his 10th house. If you look carefully at his 10th house, it's so masculine. But it's very intellectually masculine. Why is it so masculine? It's because he's the Sun and Mars in the 10th house. That's masculine. Masculine means, like Sadhguru, commanding, dominant. You must obey. But his dominance is not brutal or barbaric. It's very intellectually dominant. Because it's Virgo, and the 10th Lord Mercury, the Lord of Intelligence, the planet of intelligence, is here. Finally, the other planet which is important for the dominance factor is the Sun itself, and there it is, right there in the 10th house. So does this moon in the 2nd house indicate a very dominant, commanding person? Not in and of itself, although it's not antagonistic towards that interpretation. The reason why Sadhguru is so commanding is because of his 10th house. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. In this video, let's explore what the moon means in the 3rd house, and let's take a look at what it actually looks like in 3 real birth charts. We'll use Boy George, Will Ferrell, and George W. Bush in order to equip ourselves with the intelligent ammunition that we need to understand the moon in the 3rd house. Let's take a moment to first review what the 3rd house symbolizes and what the moon symbolizes. Here you see what the 3rd house physically is. It's the area of sky that's on the eastern side of the underground quadrant. That's why the 3rd house represents whatever it represents. The underground quadrant represents the interior of our being, and the east represents sunrise and visualization and tangibility. So the 3rd house, being on the eastern section of the underground sky, represents the expression of what's inside of us. Expressing the internal will have both an effect on your external and your internal. The 3rd house is the house of strength. Strength is the expression of your power. Power is an internal thing. Expression of power also means that the 3rd house represents skill, and expression of your power gets you into conflict with other things that are expressing their power. So the 3rd house represents conflict, or the use of power, the use of force. And so it has to do also with the people with whom we contend, our siblings and our equals, our peers. On the internal side, the internal dimension of strength is confidence, decision-making, and discipline, sticking by decisions. Also, internal power and strength means ambition. So the 3rd house has to do with our lusts, our drives, our motivations, our hunger. And the 3rd house, therefore, is about what we want. It's a self-focused house. And so it's a house of independence, individuality. Now, we understand what the 3rd house is all about. Let's take a look at the moon. The moon is a complicated planet. Because if you think about the moon, the obvious things about it is that it comes out at night, not like the sun, but like the sun, it's very bright. So it has this complicated nature of being bright, but night. And that's the 3rd thing about the moon, is that you can't really tell what it is. It keeps changing. The shape of it always changes and everything. So it's a night, bright, and a changing planet. Changing planet, this is why the moon represents flux and fluctuation. This is why it has to do with cycles, rhythm, timing, and fluids. The brightness of the moon, that's why the moon represents beauty, things that catch your eye, things that attract your eye. The nightiness of the moon, this is why it has to do with things that are unseen. So the moon represents private things. Things that people are shy about, that they don't really want to show. Things that are personal, that you keep to yourself. Or things that happen within your private space, so domestic things. The moon is therefore feminine, because femininity is an inward power. It moves inward, it moves in. Unseen means inward, internal. And so the moon also represents the internal aspect of anyone. So the mind instead of the body. The mind is the tool by which we experience emotion. It's not intellect by which we figure things out. The moon represents the mind, the thing that experiences emotions. So the moon represents emotions. Emotions are based on some permutation of happiness or sadness in past, present, or future. So happiness and sadness results from fulfilling or not fulfilling your desires. So the moon is the planet of desires. And desires are based on opinions. What you want and what you don't want is based on what you think is good and what you think is not good. So the moon is the planet of opinion, subjectivity, bias. Finally, the moon is a lot like the sun in terms of how bright it is. So like the sun, it's also an authority figure and it represents authorities. But because it's an internal feminine planet, it represents the feminine archetype of authority, whereas the sun represented the masculine archetype of authority and therefore the father. The moon, being the feminine archetype of authority, is therefore the mother. Now we understand the players, the moon and the third house. Let's put them together. The moon in the third house. What kind of interpretation do we come up with? Well, first of all, the moon is female, but the third house is masculine. The third house is about externalizing the internal thing. So if anything, it's about the conversion of femininity into masculinity. Because masculine means external comes out and feminine means internal goes in. So it's a clash between the moon being female and the third house being male. The interpretation is sabratri. That means that you're close with your competitors or close with your peers. Or it also means you're assisted by your peers or your siblings and so forth. So it's a complex situation with how one competes. When the moon is in the third house, one isn't too competitive and aggressive. Rather, they tend to get what we would call coddled by their peers. The peers will kind of like them and not treat them so much as a threat. And hence, they kind of have this sort of entitlement. The moon in the third house is sort of an entitled interpretation. They get spoon-fed or they get coddled by the people that you would think would be aggressive towards them or competitive with them. And the reason why is because they're kripana, which here basically means it evokes your kripa, which means it evokes your sympathy. The moon in the third house tends to evoke sympathy. We can say it means you're pathetic because the word pathetic means evoke sympathy. So people with the moon in the third house, they tend to be people that we can sort of feel for. We can sympathize with. They don't seem that aggressive. So therefore, we don't take that much of a competitive stance towards them. Secondly, the moon is very private, but the whole nature of the third house is to externalize and express the private thing. So it's sort of a clash, and the result is what's described as bala shaurya, which means they have strong bravery, or they're strong on the inside. They're internally strong. And this again is just another permutation of the female-male dichotomy between moon and third house. Internally female, strong male. What happens if you're internally strong, or if you have strength or bravery on the inside? It means that you are not scared to express. You like to express. You like to show or say. You don't hold things back. The third thing about the moon in the third house is that the moon is the planet of desire and the third is the house of ambition. So this is a nice thing. They're on the same page finally, exactly on the same page. And so we describe this as pramada, which basically means a lot of desires. They're desirous, or you could say wanton, lustful. And again, this word shaurya also pertains here because shaurya also means ambitious. Now, our theory about this moon in the third house is pretty clear, but let's take it out of the theory stage and come and see it in actual practice in some charts of well-known people. So we have Boy George, Will Ferrell, George Bush. Let's examine these three interpretations and how it relates to them. Is Boy George entitled and coddled and pathetic or sympathetic? Maybe not, but if you look at the raw source of this interpretation, it's very shocking. Boy George, the moon in the third house is the female-male dichotomy working together. That's Boy George. Will Ferrell is obviously not Boy George, but Will Ferrell is very entitled and coddled. He says of himself that he's an Orange County suburban child with no danger or drama ever in his life. And so the reason that he turned to comedy was just to break up the boredom. George W. Bush, super entitled, super coddled, just handed things by his dad, basically. On the second thing of being expressive, right? Boy George, again, very, very clear illustration of this principle of the moon in the third house, making somebody that's very expressive. Will Ferrell, yeah, very expressive. Look at the face that he's doing. George Bush, maybe, I'm not so sure. It doesn't really seem like it's a strong match there. And this third thing about the moon in the third house is we expect these people to be very ambitious or lusty or wanton. Boy George, sure, that's obvious. Will Ferrell, I don't know, maybe? I don't know. And Bush, really not sexually, but maybe extremely so politically. So Boy George wants to know some more detail about his chart, and he wants to know, why am I such a fit for this first bit? Why am I such a gender bender? What is it about the moon in the third house that made me a gender bender that didn't make Will Ferrell or George W. a gender bender? Well, first thing I want you to look at is the planet in his first house. It's Venus. And what is his first house? It's Taurus. So here you have an example of the first lord in a female sign. And guess what? It's also in Pisces Navamsha, which means it's exalted Venus, and also it means it's in a female Navamsha. So here's an example of the first lord in a female sign and female Navamsha. As we were learning in Paladipika, now we want to look at the moon and see if it's also in female sign and Navamsha. His moon, yes, it's in a female sign, Cancer, and its Navamsha is also Cancer. So here's the perfect example of that principle from Paladipika that we recently learned in our live streams. Here's a male person with a very strong female yoga. That's why his moon in the third house is really showing its colors in terms of female-male dichotomy. Furthermore, his moon in the third house is with Mercury, who's a transgender planet. But Boy George has another question. He says, I think I'm a lot more artistic and expressive than these other two guys, especially George W. Bush. So why is it that I'm so artistic and expressive? Bush also has moon in the third house and he's not. So for this, you just see what we just described about gender bender, because it's basically the same thing. Because female is internal, male is external. If you're bending or blurring the line between male and female, then you're allowing the internal to get expressed. Then you're artistic and expressive. So besides that, you just have an exalted Navamsha domicile Rashi Venus in the first house. And you don't expect to be artistic? Of course, right? Besides that, I always explain that artistic person will have very prominent connections between houses 3, 5, and 11. His moon in the third house is his third lord, and that transgendered Mercury that's right next to it is the fifth lord. So have you connected the third and the fifth house? Certainly. You put the third lord and the fifth lord together in the third house. And what about the 11th lord? That would be Jupiter. And where is it? It's in the 10th house. Very dominant. Now, Will Ferrell pushes George aside and he says, George is very sexy, but I'm not. How come I'm not? First thing is, look at our 8th house. Mr. Ferrell has a debilitated Saturn there, and that Saturn is his fifth lord. Fifth lord is also pretty important in terms of sexuality, sexiness, and sex drive. Second thing is, go ahead and look at the moon itself, because the interpretation of the moon is it could make you very wanton. But Will Ferrell's moon is debilitated in the third house, and even more importantly, it's with Ketu, who's asexual. Finally, take a look at Ferrell's first house. It also has Venus in it, but it's debilitated Venus. Now, George W. Bush comes late to the party and he says, hey, I'm not sexy, but I am artistic and I was the president. So how come I am artistic like these other fellas? And these other guys, they didn't become the president of the United States. So how come? So for artistic, again, let's take a look at 3, 5, and 11 and see if those houses are combining or not, or what's going on with those houses. Well, right next to his moon in the third house is Jupiter. Jupiter is the fifth lord. So the fifth lord is in the third house. And what sign is it in? Libra. Venus' sign, an artistic sign. So that covers the third and the fifth, especially the fifth. What about the other two? Third house and 11th house? The third lord is Venus and the 11th lord is Mercury. Take a look at the first house. The third and the 11th lord have combined in the first house. So, yeah, George W. Bush is not exactly Picasso, but pretty damn good. Way better than I would have expected as a painter. And also, this little Ketu that's sitting there in his fifth house has something to tell us as well. It says, psst, I'm a Raj Yoga. I'm a secret little Raj Yoga you probably didn't notice. Because I'm getting a super strong aspect from Mars, and Mars is the Yogacara. And if a node gets a strong aspect from a Yogacara, while that node is in a Kendra or a Kona, then that constitutes a Raj Yoga. So the Raj Yoga in the fifth house also increases artistic capacity. Okay, that explains why this guy's unexpectedly somewhat artistic. But how about why he became the president of the United States? Usually when we see people who have a great deal of political power or social influence, we find a lot of Raj Yogas. We do find that one Raj Yoga in his fifth house, but Bush's chart is not riding on Raj Yogas. It's riding on a Parvata Yoga. And this is not any run-of-the-mill Parvata Yoga. This is a very, very, very clear, strong Parvata Yoga. I would call it a double ultra Parvata Yoga. So definition of Parvata Yoga basically is if you have a benefic in the central houses, 1, 4, 7, and 10, without malefics being in sight. Like typically, if you can't have malefics aspecting the ascendant, so especially if you don't have malefics across from the ascendant in 6, 7, and 8, but you do have benefics in the Kendra, then you qualify for this thing called Parvata Yoga. Parvata means like a mountain. So it means, superior, having a high position. In Bush's case, he has 2 benefics, and they're not just in the Kendra, they are in the first house, and he has malefics nowhere able to look at them at all. There's no malefics in the Kendras. There's no malefics in 6, 7, and 8. The malefics are completely out of the way in 2 and 12. His outstanding social status, ability to become president of the United States, is riding on this Parvata Yoga, plus the entitlement factor granted by the moon being with Jupiter in the third house. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. To understand the moon in the fourth house, we will begin by reviewing the moon and the fourth house, and it'll be brief but very important. Here you can see what the fourth house physically is. It's literally the ground beneath your feet, or more accurately, the sky in the direction of the ground underneath your feet. So it represents everything that is below ground. So it has to do with things that are invisible or internal. This is why it has to do with emotions, and that's why it's the house of happiness, or in other words, the quality of our emotions. Also, this is why it's the house of love or devotion, because emotions are based on what you like or don't like, love or hate, and whether or not you achieve or don't achieve those things. The underground also signifies the things that you don't see. It's the part of the sky that's completely invisible. So the fourth house has to do with all things that are private or unseen. This is why it has to do with the quality of shyness, of keeping yourself unseen. It has to do with the home or the place where you are not visible, the place where you can shut the doors, shut the windows, and be invisible, not seen. It has to do also with your private space, your private property, and the ability to just kind of shut down and rest and not be active and not be visible. Furthermore, the fourth house is a very feminine house. It has to do with femininity, because femininity essentially is internality, and that's what the fourth house is all about. Finally, what's in the ground below your feet? All the roots of the trees and the plants and everything. So the fourth house represents the root from which we come. And this is why it has to do with whether or not we are rooted and grounded and stable, and also has to do with ancestry that we come from. And since it's the feminine house, this is why it has to do with our mother particularly. That was a nice review of the fourth house. Let's do the same thing quickly for the moon before we jump into asking what the moon in the fourth house represents. So when we think of the moon, we think of something that's very bright at night. And therefore, we think of something that is very dipolar, night and bright at the same time. And that dipolarity of the moon is why it symbolizes fluctuation, and it's also expressed in the physical reality of it fluctuating in its size so dramatically. So it symbolizes fluctuation and change or cycle or fluidity. The moon also represents beautiful stuff, because it's bright, and bright things catch your eye. The moon, because it's associated with night, then it also has to do with unseen things, and that should also ring a bell, because we just talked about the fourth house, which is all about the unseen thing. The moon also is a planet that symbolizes private things, and so it has all those things in common with the fourth house, including the whole thing about being internal, and including the mind being the internal part of ourself, the mind being the tool with which we experience emotions, emotions being based on our desires, our likes, dislikes, our loves, hates, and our likes and dislikes being based on our opinions of things. And hence also the moon is very, very feminine, because femininity is always internal. Interesting thing about the moon and this dichotomy of it being bright at night at the same time is that the brightness indicates that it's an authority. It's so much brighter than any star. But the nightiness of the moon, it's nighty and it's brighty. The nightiness of it makes it feminine, so we're dealing with feminine authority, and that means the mom. Now let's take the bold leap and try to interpret the moon in the fourth house. And now that we did a little bit of work and reviewed the fourth house and the moon separately, it's not that much of a bold leap. We're pretty ready to do it intelligently. We have three things really on the table. We have the fact that the moon is feminine and the fourth house is also feminine. And hence all the things that are associated with the internality of femininity are going to be the same. with the moon as the fourth house. So the second thing on the table is the privacy of the moon and the privacy of the fourth house. I'm sure is going to go really well together. But the third thing on our plate to interpret is the fluctuality or the fluidity or instability of the moon versus the rootedness and stability and groundedness of the fourth house. So let's take these one at a time and turn them into actual interpretations. The femininity of the moon going along with the femininity of the fourth house gives us the interpretation of what we would call sukhi, which is a Sanskrit word that means pleasant. Feminine. So feminine is sukhi. Feminine is nice. Feminine is gentle. Feminine is pleasant. Feminine is beautiful. Feminine is attractive. Feminine is sensually pleasing. Soft, etc. So the moon in the fourth house indicates a person who's pleasant or attractive or sensual. Feminine and feminine also means you have a lot of wealth, because femininity produces wealth. So the home, the private property and everything, that whole strand of meaning, the fourth house and the moon is coming out here. And the third thing about female and female, it means suridhi. So surit means good heart and it also means good mind. So the moon in the fourth house, we expect the person to be good-hearted, means like a loyal friend, loyal in their friendships. And good mind in the sense of they have a lot of imagination. They think a lot, they dream a lot, they plan a lot, they come up with ideas. The second thing about the moon in the fourth house is that they're both private, and this is very interesting. This generates the interpretation of yasha, which means fame. So how do you get fame from a private planet being in a private house? It might seem weird, but if you watch my videos about planets and houses or planets and signs, you see that this is a very consistent thing that happens in interpretations. If the moon is the planet of privacy and it's in the house of privacy, that means your privacy is going fine. You don't have any worries about privacy. You don't have needs for privacy. Your privacy is already taken care of. So you feel confident. You don't feel like you have to hide anything. You don't feel ashamed of anything. And that gives you the ability to disclose and be out there and visible. The third thing about the moon in the fourth house was this clash between the moon being fluctuating and the fourth house being stable. This is what we would call bhog tyag. So that means sometimes up, sometimes down, sometimes enjoying, sometimes suffering, sometimes happy, sometimes sad. Dramatic changes. Not a lot of stability. An unstable person, a fluctuating person. So dramatic changes in how they feel about things, dramatic changes in what they do, dramatic changes in their life. They try to make dramatic changes and so forth. So I have a modest database of well-known people who I use as examples in these videos of planets and signs and planets in the houses. When I check that database for people with the moon in the fourth house, a whole lot of names come up, considering that I have a pretty modestly sized database. And that makes sense because one of the expectations is the privacy of the moon with the privacy of the fourth house makes you have no concerns about privacy. And hence, you go out there and you can become famous. So there happens to be quite a lot of famous people with the moon in the fourth house. It's not hard to find example charts. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Mozart, Jim Morrison, Russell Brand, Candy Bar, Anais Nin, Caitlyn Jenner, and then some very big politicians like Adolf Hitler, Karl Marx, and Malcolm X. And there's even two very terrible, well-known criminals, David Berkowitz and Richard Ramirez. So now, let's take one person from each group and look at their chart in detail and see what role the moon in the fourth house is and is not playing in making them who they are. Let's take Mozart, Malcolm X, and David Berkowitz. So Mozart says, "Am I imaginative and sensual? I sure am. I am a great composer of music. But if we ask Malcolm X if he's imaginative and sensual, he might say, I guess you could say I have a good imagination because I'm envisioning a different reality, but I don't know if I would really say I'm all that sensual. And if we ask David Berkowitz if he's very imaginative, sensual, etc., he kind of is in the most perverted and crazy way, like very lost in fantasy, very lost in his imagination. But it's a big kind of question mark from him of why is it such a negative thing for him but such a positive thing for Mozart. That's something that we'll look at when we look at his chart specifically. If we ask Mozart how he feels about the famous thing and whether he's unashamed, he's going to say, you bet your breeches. Very much like that. And same thing, Malcolm X would say, yeah, I am not scared. I'm bold and I'm going to go out and speak. And even David Berkowitz would say, that's right, I'm famous. I became famous for doing horrible things and I liked it. If we ask them all about the third thing, about this dramatic change, we will get some more clarity actually about what this really means. With Mozart was an extremely impractical person. He could have been extremely wealthy, but he didn't care very much about money. So that is one of the facets that should be brought out about this dichotomy of the moon being fluid and the fourth house being solid. It's going to present the dichotomy also of idealism versus practicality. So Mozart's a very good example of a person that's really sacrificing the practicality for the sake of their imagination and idealism. Also, Mozart had a very unstable body. He had very unstable health. So when we look at his chart, we'll figure out why. Malcolm X, is he very dramatic? He is so dramatic. He's very, very volatile. And David Berkowitz, is he extremely unstable? Extremely unstable. David Berkowitz wants to know, how come I got none of the good stuff of the moon in the fourth house, but all the bad versions of everything? Well, the moon says hello. He says, look at where I am. I'm at 4 degrees, and look who is right on top of me. Also at 4 degrees, Rahu. And if you are not familiar with that signature, you must be new to my video, so please subscribe to the channel, because this signature comes up in all the serial killers, almost all of them. Very tight conjunction with Moon and Rahu. So what Moon and Rahu is not going to, it's going to really exaggerate the instability, unrealness, impracticality that's possible with the moon in the fourth house. Furthermore, his moon is in the fourth house with something called the Kama Druma Yoga. It's one of the more important yogas for the moon, whether or not it has neighbors or anybody with it in its house. So it's all alone. It's in Aquarius, it has nobody in Capricorn, it has nobody in Pisces. Except Rahu, that is not even a planet, it's just a force. So it's very lonely out there, and it is even all alone in the Kendras, and its own Kendras are also empty. So it has 100% superpowered Kama Druma Yoga, which makes the moon extremely unreliable and unstable. That's why David Berkowitz has all the instability. That's really kind of just a background potential of the moon in the fourth house. And his chart brings that background potential out to the foreground. And it also doesn't help that his first lord is in the 8th house with the 8th lord. Now, Malcolm X also has a question. He says, step aside, David Berkowitz. I got a question for the astrologer. He says, you said moon in the 4th house was Surit, nice, gentle. I'm tough. I'm tough and I'm serious. I'm not gentle and sensual, so why is that? So Mars goes, bzzz, hello, look at me. I am at 6 degrees of Cancer and your ascendant is at 5 degrees of Capricorn. That means your ascendant is under the full influence of Mars. Mars is anything but Surit. Mars is anything but gentle and feminine and sensual and so forth. Also, Saturn says, I'm over here too, and I am about 60 degrees away from the ascendant, and I have about 100% aspect on 60 degrees. So Saturn is also immensely influential from Scorpio. And then the moon says, yeah, I'm in the 4th house, but zing, I'm in Aries in the 4th house, a martial sign. So there's nothing about Malcolm X's chart which is soft and gentle. Even his Jupiter in the 1st house is in Capricorn. And so that's why the potential of the moon in the 4th house to produce a feminine, Surit, nice person isn't really there in Malcolm X. Instead, he becomes a very serious, intense, hardcore person. Mozart now walks up to the stand and says, I was really obsessed with work. I could not stop working. How come? So Virgo says hi. Virgo is your rising sign. Virgo likes to work. Also, your first lord says hi because it's in the 6th house, and the 6th house is all about work. But then Mozart says, I didn't really care that much about that. I have a more serious question. I noticed you were talking about David Berkowitz, and he had this Kama Druma Yoga that, was very terrifyingly deep. But I have the same thing, don't I? I have the moon in Sagittarius with nobody else in Sagittarius and nobody in the sign after it, Capricorn, and nobody in the sign before it, Scorpio. And furthermore, I have nobody in any of the Kendras or angles to my moon, and I have nobody in any of the Kendras or angles to my ascendant, except for Rahu, who's not even a planet. So I have the exact same thing that David Berkowitz has. How come I'm not like him? I'm not a mass murderer. I'm not a lunatic. The main thing, the biggest difference is the distance between Mozart's moon to the nodes compared to the distance between Berkowitz's moon to the nodes. This is very important in interpreting the moon, anywhere it is to look at its distance from the nodes, from its nodes. That will show you the moon's declination. Mozart's moon is just about 90 degrees away from the nodes, which is just about as far as you can get away from the nodes, which means it's at the apex of its declination, which means it's very strong and powerful. Berkowitz, on the other hand, is exactly conjoined with the node. That means it's at no declination. And that makes a big difference in determining what kind of relationship the moon has with Rahu, the destabilizing force. Furthermore, there's a lot of other important clues. Mozart's moon is in a Jupiter sign, and Berkowitz's moon is in a Saturn sign. Mozart's first lord is with the 9th lord, aspected by Jupiter. But Berkowitz's first lord is with the 8th lord, aspected by Saturn. So you see the huge difference between the 9th versus 8th influence, Jupiter versus Saturn influence. Mozart is 9th in Jupiter, Berkowitz is 8th in Saturn. Those are not the same. Furthermore, what you see with Mozart really, and this is the clue to why he had such bad health, because the moon in the 4th house can give a lot of instability, and that comes out in Mozart's health because he has the node right on his ascendant. And the ascendant represents the body, whereas Berkowitz has a node right on his moon, and the node and the moon represents the mind. So we can say you both have difficulty, indicated by this Kama Druma Yoga. For Mozart, it's the difficulty with your body. You died in your mid-30s. For Berkowitz, it's difficulty with your mind. You went nuts. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. In this video, we will explain what the moon symbolizes when it's in the 5th house. And in order to make it clearer in the end, and also to give you a better intuition for the nuances of it, we'll begin that by explaining what the fifth house itself is. Here's a visual that lets you see exactly what the fifth house literally is. It's the sky that's below the ground, but on the western border of that section. That is the basis for what it symbolizes. The undergroundness of the fifth house makes it symbolize internal things, and the westness of the fifth house makes it symbolize other people. So it symbolizes the way that our internal being interacts with the external world and other people. So that means two things basically. One is the way we interact with the world, and the other is the way we empathize with or digest the world. And this is why the fifth house is the house of intelligence, because intelligence is the ability to make sense out of the data that comes into your mind from the external world. And the fifth house is also the house of compassion. The things that are happening to the other people, you can relate to that. You can bring it in and make it a part of yourself. That's compassion. That's the nature of the fifth house. And it's the house of love, because that's the basis of love. Love means caring about other people. The fifth is also the house of communication, the ability to utilize languages and symbols to express our inner feelings and our inner concepts to other people. The fifth house is the house of expression, creativity, and art, because that's exactly what expression and art is. It's communication. And the fifth is the house of children, because what higher form of creativity and expression is there than to produce another living being? Now that we know what the fifth house is, let's quickly review what the moon is. Then we'll be really well equipped to interpret the moon in the fifth house. The moon is a very bright planet, yet it's only bright at night. Because it embodies these two opposites in one thing, being both bright and dark. It symbolizes fluctuation or change, fluidity, cyclicity. Because it's bright, it signifies being very attractive, being beautiful, attracting the eye. And because it's nighty, it signifies unseen things or private things. Because it's unseen, it signifies the internal things. The internal part of the self is the mind. The mind is the tool for perceiving emotions. Emotions are reactions to desires. The outcome of our desires produces emotions. Desires are reactions to our opinions. So the moon symbolizes our opinions and subjectivity itself. And the moon, being an internal and beautiful symbol, therefore symbolizes femininity, and being a bright symbol signifies authority or power. And combining the two, femininity with authority, the moon symbolizes the maternal figure, the matriarch, the mother. Now, to understand the moon in the fifth house, it's not so difficult now. So all we have to do is call to mind the things about the fifth house that have something very obvious to do with something about the moon. So for example, the moon represents mother, and the fifth house represents children. So that's something that's going to be very key to focus on, to understand and intuit and get a very rich picture of what the moon in the fifth house represents. Another example is that the moon represents the mind, and the fifth house is basically about the mind because it's about the intellect. It's a portion of the mind. And the third thing is that the moon is feminine, and the fifth house is loving and compassionate, which is a feminine asset. So if we're very familiar with how symbology works, we might keep it at just these 3 points. And that would give us a lot of unspecified but intuitive understanding of what the moon symbolizes in the fifth house. But let's spell it out a little bit more to help you get used to how to use symbolism. So for example, the fact that the moon is the mother and the fifth house is children, that indicates that the moon in the fifth house represents something in Sanskrit called Suputra. Suputra basically means you are a good parent. You get along well with children. But it also means you're a good creator, because put means to put or to express. So you're a good creator, you're a good expresser. So there's an artistic slant to it as well. On the topic of the moon being the mind and the fifth house being the intellect, in Sanskrit we would call this Sumedha. Sumedha means you have a good essence. Your internal is good. You have a good heart. You have a good intellect. Your focus, your concentration is good. Your imagination is good. Concentration is good. And then on the topic of the moon being feminine and the fifth house being compassionate, in Sanskrit we would call this Mriduga, which means your way of behaving is very gentle, elegant, soft, affectionate. Or Amatya. People who have the moon in the fifth house feel more relatable to more people. They feel familiar and therefore they feel trustable. Now, in my small database of maybe 20 or 30 well-known people with verified birth times, there's an awful lot of people who have the moon in the fifth house. And this is because it's a very desirable placement. It's a very synergistic placement. You can see there's no real clashes between the moon and the fifth house, and so it tends to help people become very successful. So who has the moon in the fifth house in my small database of people? Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And what does that really exemplify about the moon in the fifth house? It represents the principle of femininity and compassion together, making an amatya person who's relatable. Donald Trump, Barack Obama, especially Donald Trump, is very, very relatable to the common person. Barack Obama felt very, very trustworthy. The differences between these people, of course, are based on the differences in the rest of their chart and the different things that affect their moon in the fifth house. Another group of people, there's a lot of artists. Pablo Picasso, Charles Bukowski, Steven Spielberg, Ernest Hemingway, Stephen King, Helen Keller. Very expressive people, very creative people. What is this all about? Suputra. Good creator, very good at expressing. Sumedha. Good imagination, good creativity. And then one more name, which is particularly interesting in how kind of disturbing it is to find on this list, Ted Bundy. What the hell is Ted Bundy, a serial rapist, murderer, doing on this list? The moon in the fifth house. Is he also Amatya, like Donald Trump and Barack Obama? Is he also has his feminine compassion resonance, making him very relatable, familiar, trustable? Unfortunately, yes. That was how he was able to accomplish the horrific things that he accomplished. But as I said, the differences between these people are all due to the different conditions in the rest of the chart, besides the fact that they have the moon in the fifth house. So why don't we take a close look at Ted Bundy's chart to figure out what makes him so different than the rest of these. So here's Ted Bundy's birth chart, verified birth time, and he is complaining, of course, that we are calling him falsely trustworthy. But the evidence of him definitely being falsely trustworthy is very obvious in this chart. Look at his moon in the fifth house. It's with Mars conjoined Ketu. If you're familiar with astrology at all, that is a huge red flag on 2 points. Just to have the moon very near to a node is a red flag. But to have it very near a node with a malefic is a big red flag. And this moon is very close to the sun with Ketu and Mars, which means that his moon in the fifth house, fine, he's got the moon in the fifth house, so he's very feminine, good looking, relatable. But it's right after an eclipse with Mars, the violent planet. Now, I recently released a new nakshatra report, which is now available. You can get it for your own birth chart. It's on my website, victorcara.com. If we use the information that report gives to take a look at Ted Bundy's nakshatras. It will also explain why he, although has the moon in the 5th house, supposed to be a nice person, isn't a nice person. This report tallies up his prominence of nakshatras, and we find out that Jyeshta is overwhelmingly the most prominent nakshatra, followed by Anuradha and Pushya, meaning that he's going to use the qualities of Anuradha and Pushya, which are very loving, affectionate, feminine appearing. Those are going to be utilized by Jyeshta, which is very selfish. The report also tallies up the nakshatra types. Ted Bundy has an extreme dominance of the Tikshna type. Tikshna is the type that is very volatile and very kind of cutting. And then the report also tallies up the pairs of the types into 3 groups, which are basically masculine, feminine, and dexterous. So as you can see, he has an extreme predominance of masculinity. So that's the context in which the moon in the 5th house exists for this person. This report, by the way, also gives you interpretations per planet in nakshatra. The things that it says about Ted Bundy are very interesting. The moon in Jyeshta, all about intrigues, subterfuge. Mars in Jyeshta, a strategist and an opportunist. Now, he doesn't just have the moon in Jyeshta, and he doesn't just have Mars in Jyeshta. He has moon and Mars in Jyeshta. Plus Ketu in Jyeshta, subterfuge, misdirection, lying, overthrowing, taking advantage of other people. On top of this deadly trio in Jyeshta, he has the sun in Anuradha. And the sun in Anuradha is not very great for romantic relationships. So that sets the tone for all of his intrigue and espionage and opportunism. Furthermore, he has Saturn in Pushya, which means that he's at odds with those who establish what's right and wrong. He's at odds with the law. Rahu in Rohini. Put Rahu in Rohini and the sun in Anuradha. Rahu in Rohini basically is the same thing. It's like a difficulty controlling your passion, difficulty controlling your arousal, intense compulsion for romance or sexuality. That's fine if you just have Rahu in Rohini, but if you have Rahu in Rohini and the sun in Anuradha and Saturn in Pushya, it's trouble. On top of all this is Jupiter in Swati. Jupiter and Swati, in the same chart that Saturn is in Pushya, they both indicate the same thing: being distant from the law, being at odds with the lawgivers. So this really explains why you can on one hand have Barack Obama with the moon in the 5th house, and on the other hand have Ted Bundy or Donald Trump or Helen Keller. All sorts of different people can have one placement be the same, because the rest of their chart may be completely different, and even the rest of the things about their moon may be completely different. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcarrot.com/R2. Thank you so much. Let's talk about the moon in the 6th house. Here you can see what the 6th house is, literally speaking. It's the portion of the sky that's below the western horizon, and that is why it symbolizes everything that it symbolizes, which we could summarize on the phrase supporting the west. So what's the west all about? The west is where the sun sets. So it symbolizes disappearance, and it also symbolizes other people because the sun represents the self. If the 6th house supports that stuff, that means the 6th house is supportive of disappearance and supportive of other people. Being supportive of disappearance is why it's the house of uncertainty. Uncertainty is what allows you to lose things or not recognize things, not understand things, not be able to see things clearly. Now that's a kind of mental or intellectual sense of disappearance, but there's also a real physical sense of disappearance, like dying. And so the sixth house being supportive of dying is why it's the house of illness and has a lot to do with how well you digest. The sixth is also the house of enemies, because enemies are people that don't support you, they're supportive of other people. It's the house of duty, because duty is how we support other people. Finally, it's also the house of debt, because that's what we owe other people. And so it concerns matters of being indebted to and indentured to and in servitude to other people. Now let's discuss the moon. The moon is a bright planet that you see at night. And because of this dichotomy between being bright but night, it's a dichotomous or a dipolar planet. Because of that dipolarity that's inherent in the moon, it symbolizes fluctuation or change or cyclicity. Because of the brightness of the moon, it symbolizes beauty and attractiveness. Because of the nightness of the moon, it symbolizes what is unseen or private. Also, it symbolizes the unseen portion of the self, which is the internal self, so it signifies the mind. The mind is the thing that experiences emotions. Emotions are based on desires. Desires are based on opinion and subjectivity and bias. So the moon symbolizes all these things. And also, because it's internal, it symbolizes the internal gender, femininity. And finally, one more thing about it being bright, because it's bright, that symbolizes being powerful. But because it's internal, it symbolizes being feminine or internal power. So it symbolizes the feminine or maternal authority figure. Now, to understand the moon in the sixth house, all we have to do is think, what is it about the moon that really resonates with something about the sixth house? So, for example, the moon has to do with health, because beauty comes from health. So what does health resonate with? Well, health resonates with illness. The sixth house is about illness, but it resonates with it in a negative way, right? So that is something that is going to describe or allow us to intuit what the moon represents in the sixth house. Another thing is that the moon is a peace planet because it's shy. So it's tranquil and it's calm. But the sixth house is not peaceful, it's problematic, and it's about dealing with problems. So again, these things resonate with each other, but in a disharmonious way. And finally, the moon is a maternal planet, and the sixth house is a house of enemies. So in a sense, that's a clash, because the mother is supposed to be the friend, but the sixth house has to do with enemies. But in a sense, it's not entirely a clash, because the mother is authority and power. And putting power where the enemies are is pretty good. So these three resonances between the moon and the sixth house are the keys to intuiting what the moon symbolizes in the sixth house. I'll show you now how to unpack it a bit, how to expand it a bit and put it into words. Let's go up to the first one where the moon is health, but the sixth house is illness. This is why the moon in the sixth house signifies alpayus. Alpayu means disease or short-lived, short lifespan. And remember, disease means not easy. So the moon in the sixth house, besides this basic physical problem of illness or short life, it also signifies the sense of not being easy, not being an easy person, and not being at ease. Not really able to find comfort very easily. Now let me show you how you can unpack the second issue, the moon being peace, but the sixth house being problems. This one we would call amati. Amati means disagreeable. In conflict, not able to find peace. Not very oriented towards conciliation. And now the third thing about the moon in the sixth house, which is really the main thing about the moon in the sixth house, is the issue of maternity and enmity. So again, amati is an important word here because we mentioned it's argumentative. But we're talking about being competent at fighting, competent at dealing with problems. So we could say that the moon in the sixth house signifies somebody who's argumentative in a brilliant way. Another word we can use to describe this particular resonance between the moon and the sixth house is paribhavi. Paribhavi means somebody who conquers others, someone who lays siege to others, someone who surrounds others, doesn't let others go, someone who belittles others, puts others down. So that also means someone who's very great, someone who's superior to others. So the moon in the sixth house, as a result of it being the maternal figure in the house of enemies, has the sense of just fighting others and defeating them and pushing the problems down, solving the problems, belittling others, and having kind of a superiority air to it. And finally, one interesting phrase describing this particular dynamic is udararogi. Now, in a sense, udararogi is just another way of saying alpayus, which means they get sick. But it also means they have something called the generosity disease. And this is a very interesting thing about the moon in the sixth house. Motherhood in the house of problems. Motherhood is generous, but now it's in a place where it has to deal with problems. So there's problems with generosity. The individual is either overly generous, giving way too much, or overly harsh, not being generous at all. Now that we're kind of clear, or hopefully getting clear about these three issues with the moon in the sixth house, we could look at some charts that have the moon in the sixth house and use those charts to clarify these ideas. So let's use Einstein, Vincent van Gogh, and Srila Prabhupada. Einstein is up first. Is Einstein a person who really illustrates the alpayus concept? Definitely. Half of his life was battling chronic diseases. Why does this aspect of the moon in the sixth house come through so vividly for Einstein? Well, what helps that a lot is the fact that it's his first lord in the sixth house. And not only does his first lord go to the sixth house, but his planet of disease, Saturn, is debilitated in a prominent place. Let's look at the next term, amati. The first aspect of it is to be very argumentative, successfully argumentative, brilliantly argumentative. He's very brilliant. Why does Einstein have such an intellectual twist on this argumentative nature of the moon in the sixth house? Well, that's really because his fifth lord is exalted in a very dominant position in the chart, where it's aspecting the ascendant very strongly and aspecting all the planets in its own 10th house very strongly, and where it's in Raja Yoga via house exchange. Second facet of amati is just plain disagreeable. And Einstein is an excellent example of a very disagreeable person. He's thought to have had autism, and autism is all about solitariness and disintegration with the conventional world and society. So he's very disagreeable. And why does his chart make that aspect of the moon come to such an extreme? Well, one of the things you should do, whatever house the moon is in, is you should also look at the fourth house, because the fourth house symbolizes many of the same things that the moon does. So in Einstein's case, his fourth lord is conjoined the debilitated Saturn. Now, another thing that we expect from the moon in the sixth is paribhavi, which means to belittle others and be much better than others. Einstein very, very much so. Very belittling towards others. Finally, did Einstein have udararogi, the generosity disease? Super. And certainly in the sense of being very, very harsh and not gentle with family and wife and stuff like that. And the indicators of that, again, are the same as the indicators for disagreeableness. So it would be the fourth lord being in such conjunction with the debilitated Saturn. Now let's take a look at Vincent van Gogh's chart. and see if that helps us crystallize these concepts about the moon in the sixth house. Alpayus, for Vincent van Gogh, extremely alpayus. He only lived to be 37, and his cause of death is suicide. So was he not an easygoing person? Was he not at ease? Was he not comfortable? Extremely. So why so? Well, just like Einstein, his moon in the sixth house is also the first lord. But unlike Einstein, look at that combination that he has in the sixth house. His K2 is right on top of that moon, and his sixth lord is right on top of that K2. So that's really a heavy duty moon in the sixth house. How about the quality of Amati? Being disagreeable. Very disagreeable, very difficult for him to deal with people. Not very well integrated into society, not very well integrated into relationships. What really helps this come out, besides that tremendous combination that he has in the sixth house? Saturn being in his 11th house, which is the house of being at ease and sociable and so forth, which gives a very strong aspect to his ascendant, which is also an indication of not liking himself. Paribhavi, meaning that he should be better than other people and belittling of other people. Super, he's extremely renowned. Why so? Look at his 10th house. It has the exalted sun in it. So you see, the real point is, when you have something like moon in the sixth house, then you have a palette, to use Van Gogh analogies, you have a palette of colors that you could paint with, but not every moon in the sixth house will choose to use the same colors in the painting of that individual, depending on what the rest of the chart is like. And Udararogi, the generosity disease for Van Gogh, very much. He's a really good illustration of the generosity disease, especially in how he took in the prostitute and the pregnant prostitute with her daughter and took care of her, and then she just went on to not love him at all, and then he just moved out. So his life is full of this too much generosity to the wrong people, giving love and never getting it back, and then being very grumpy about that and very disturbed about that. Again, you don't really need too much else in a chart to explain how difficult this particular moon in the sixth house is, because it's right next to K2 and right next to the sixth lord. But just bear in mind that he also has the 9th lord in the sixth house with K2. So the 9th house is kind of like how well your generosity will pay off, how much result you will get from good deeds. And if it's in the 6th house, then you don't really get fair reciprocation for your efforts. Now, of course, Van Gogh is the great painter, and we didn't really see anything about him being a great painter in any of these issues. It's because there's a lot of things about him besides him being a great painter. But since we have his chart up here on the screen, let's just mention some of the things. The classic thing to look for artistic skill is combination of 3rd, 5th, and 11th house. And look at Vincent van Gogh's 9th house, where he has Mars and Venus together. That's the 5th lord conjoining the 11th lord, while both of them perfectly aspect the 3rd house. On top of that, the combination of this 5th and 11th lord aspecting the 3rd house is a Raj Yoga, because they're also the 4th and the 5th lords. And on top of that, he has another Raj Yoga to his 1st lord by virtue of it joining his 9th. Finally, let's look at Prabhupada. Is Prabhupada a good example of Alpayus? No, not really. He lived to 81 and he was fairly healthy. So why? Well, look at his 1st house. Unlike Einstein and Van Gogh, where their 1st lord goes to the 6th house, instead his 1st lord goes to the 11th, where it aspects the 1st. So his 1st house is strong. So you can't really expect his health to be difficult or his life to be short. How about Amati? Amati, Prabhupada is a great example of Amati. very argumentative and very convincing. So that's partly just because he has Capricorn rising, and therefore his sixth house is Gemini, and therefore a moon in the sixth house is also a moon in Gemini, and Gemini is an intelligent sign and a sign that knows how to communicate. So moon in Gemini in the sixth really knows how to debate or present an argument or convince you of something. And disagreeable, very disagreeable. And again, look to the fourth house for that, because fourth house is about the house of agreement and harmony. And here comes his fourth lord into the sixth house. So both his moon and his fourth lord are in the sixth house. Paribhavi, he's extremely renowned and also very belittling, very kind of condescending or belittling of things which are inferior or subordinate or not worthwhile. And so why is he so superior? Well, look at his ninth and his 10th house. This is really where his power lies, is in the mutual exchange between his ninth lord and his 10th lord, creating a Raj Yoga. And did Prabhupada have Udara Rogi, the generosity disease? He's a good example of it, because on one hand, he gave so much of himself. He sacrificed everything for this cause. And there's no way that you can get back the reciprocation of that amount of sacrifice. So in one sense, he's very, very overly generous, but in the other sense, he's extremely strict and very unforgiving and very unyielding. And so he has both aspects of the generosity disease. And to look at for a reason why this is so well illustrated in Prabhupada, it's first of all just simple that his fourth lord is in the sixth house with the moon. So both the moon and the fourth lord being in the sixth house. But also take a look at Jupiter, which is kind of the opposite of this. By nature, Jupiter is generous and positive. His Jupiter is in the 8th house with Ketu, exactly with Ketu. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. This video will explain the moon in the 7th house, and I will explain what it symbolizes, and I'll show you how to actually read it in real charts using 3 well-known people. But the best place to begin this discussion is by understanding what the moon itself symbolizes and what the 7th house itself symbolizes. And here is the 7th house. Literally, physically, it is the area of the sky that is right around the western horizon. And that's why it symbolizes what it symbolizes, because the western horizon is where the sunset happens. And the sunset represents 2 things: disappearance and other people. The reason it represents disappearance is obvious: the sun disappears. The reason it represents other people is a little less obvious. It's, again, because the sun disappears and the sun represents self. So if self takes a back seat, that means other people become prominent. So those are the 2 basic symbolisms of the 7th house: disappearance and other people. That's why the 7th is the house of endings, and please be clear that it is the house of endings and the house of death. But the 6th and the 8th house are more instrumental in bringing about or preventing death. Yet the 7th house is about the death itself. And it's also about things just going away or dispersing. It's a house of travel or even losing things. Obviously, the 7th house is very famous as the house of marriage and partners, because it's the house of others and our relationship with others. And this is why it's the house of intercourse, which has a sexual connotation and also just means in basic how we relate with other people and how we cooperate with other people. And finally, it's a house of exchange or commerce or business, because that's one of the ways in which we relate with other people. Now, doing the same thing for the moon, when you look at the moon, you realize that it's bright, but you only see it at night. And so it has a sort of a dichotomy or a dipolarity to it, that it's bright, but it only comes out when it's night. So it's bright and dark at the same time. and hence it represents things which are fluctuating, things which are dipolar, things which are one thing and the other. They're fluid. They go back and forth between states. Because it's bright, it represents things that attract your eye and are beautiful. And because it's night, it represents things that are unseen and private. So things that are shy or personal or domestic. Also, because it's unseen, it represents things that are internal. This is why it represents the mind. What is the mind? The mind is the emotional sense. What is an emotion? An emotion is a reaction to fulfilling or not fulfilling a desire. And what is a desire? A desire is a want based on an opinion. And so the moon represents all these things: subjectivity, bias, opinions, which generate desires, which generate emotions, which are experienced by the mind. Also, since it's internal, it represents the internal gender, which is female. And since it's bright, it represents power and authority, but since it's female, it represents matriarchal or maternal power and feminine authority. Now we're clear about what the moon represents and what the 7th house represents. We can go ahead and figure out how to mix them and understand what the moon represents when it's in the 7th house. But the 7th house is a bit different than the rest of the houses because it's exactly around the western horizon. And concomitant with that, planets always have an aspect, full power, to their opposition. In other words, to the point that's 180 degrees across the sky from them. So, if a planet is in the 7th house, it therefore very likely affects the ascendant by its aspect. The more that you see it line up to the ascendant, you'll get these effects from the moon in the 7th house, which don't really have to do that much with the 7th house, have more to do with the moon affecting the ascendant. The physical properties of the planet in the 7th house come out by affecting the ascendant. So in the case of the moon, we expect visual beauty. They're beautiful, they look good, they attract the eye. And while the physical aspects of the planet affect the ascendant, the other aspects of the planet affect the descendant. In other words, the planet is disappearing. It's going down over the western horizon. So why the physical parts affect the ascendant is because the ascendant is physical. But the rest of this stuff sets. So in the moon's case, it's a setting of the mother mostly. So it's a distance from mother, or it may be like a distance from emotionalness. Now those are the two unique effects of the moon in the 7th house by virtue of its relationship to the ascendant, which you should check by degree to see how intense those will be in the particular chart. There's another 3 effects that come from the way the moon combines with the 7th house. So for example, the moon is a very domestic planet, and the 7th house is a marriage house. And that's a favorable combination of symbolisms. Also, the moon is a feminine planet, and the 7th house is a partnership house. That's also a favorable combination of symbolism because femininity does well with partnership. Also, the moon is a very cyclic planet, but the 7th house is a very final house. So this is a non-harmonious interaction of the symbolism. And if we explore these 3 things about how the moon resonates with the 7th house, we'll get a good intuition for what the interpretation of the moon in the 7th house should be. To spell out a little bit, the part about the moon being domestic and the 7th house being marriage, that means that you probably have a good marriage. You have a desirable marriage partner. On the second thing, femininity and partnership, it's a similar effect. You're attractive to partners. People want to marry you. You're a desirable partner. But also your partnerships function well for you. You have prosperous partnerships. And then on the non-harmonious resonance of cyclicity in the moon, but finality in the 7th house, this is like a problem with endings, and they want newness. They need the cycle to go around, and they need stimulation and newness. That's a good basic template to work from to understand the moon in the 7th house. But we should also look at it in real charts to see how this basic template actually plays out in some specific cases. So let's use 3 high-profile people: Marilyn Monroe, Hugh Hefner, and Jeffrey Dahmer. Marilyn Monroe, if we ask her if she's visually beautiful, she's going to answer yes, of course. Why so much? Well, look at the moon. It is quite well aligned with the ascendant. It's at 19 degrees, and the ascendant is at 13. So you can expect a lot of the effect of the aspect of the moon to the ascendant, which is a lot of beauty. In addition to that, her moon is joined with Jupiter, who is the 8th lord. The 8th lord is reproductive and sexy. So the beautiful moon in the 7th house aspecting the ascendant is conjoined with Jupiter, which is a reproductive planet owning the 8th house, the reproductive house. So it's a sexy kind of beauty that really comes through. And then really to make it sure that she's very beautiful, her first lord, the sun, is in the 11th house, Gemini, with the 11th lord, Mercury. Mercury is very good looking, not in the sense of sexy, but in the sense of just well formed. So she's getting sexiness from the 8th lord, and she's getting the well formedness from the 11th house and the 11th lord, and the beauty and attractiveness and this kind of sparkle from the moon. If we ask Marilyn if she was distanced from her mother, which is the effect of the moon setting, she will also say yes, very much, because she was raised by her grandmother, right? So what is that? Well, besides having the moon in the 7th house, it's supported by the fact that her 4th lord is in the 8th house. And this is important for you to understand about astrology, is real effects don't come from having just one indication in a chart. Real effects come from having multiple indications in a chart. So moon in the 7th house is one indication of being distanced from mother. It's not going to become a reality if that's the only thing in the chart that indicates distance from the mother. But in Monroe's case, in addition to the moon in the 7th, the 4th lord is in the 8th, and the 6th lord, Saturn, is in the 4th. If we ask Marilyn if she had prosperous partnerships, she would say kind of financially, but not maritally. Her marital partnerships didn't work out. And why is that? Well, on one hand, it's really nice that she has the moon and Jupiter in the 7th house, but it's for a Leo ascendant. So that means that the moon is the 12th lord and Jupiter is the 8th lord. So her 7th house has the 12th and 8th lords in it. And while that is very sexy, it doesn't give a stable marriage. But as far as the financial partnerships being good, the first lord being in the 11th house, Gemini, with Mercury, is great for that. And if we ask her if she, doesn't like ends, or she gets bored easy, she needs newness, she'll say yes for sure. And that's one reason, is just having the first lord in the 11th house with Mercury, while you have moon in the 7th house. Now, let's take a look at a sort of similar person, Hugh Hefner. Is he visually beautiful? Well, he's not the worst looking guy in the world, but he's very into visual beauty. And he says, yeah, I really love visual beauty. I took a lot of photos of it. So you could see that in his case, his moon in the 7th house is his 11th lord, and it is conjoined with his 9th lord, who's exalted, and who is Venus. So here he's really profiting from the visual beauty of others. We ask him if he's distanced from his mother, he will also say yes. He's very unlike his mother, and his whole move towards being the Hugh Hefner that we know was kind of as a reaction against the puritanical nature of his mother and father. So we would say yes. And again, like Monroe, it has to do with his 4th house, supporting that his 4th lord is in the 6th with Mars. Does he have prosperous partnerships? He would say, yeah, I really had great partnerships with many people, and financially as well as romantically. Not maritally, but only after a divorce did that happen. So one thing about his chart is you could see the 7th Lord is also Jupiter. So the 7th Lord is also in the 6th house with Mars. And if we asked if he needed newness and got bored easily and stuff like that, yes. I mean, look at him. And I think what would really support that, besides his moon in the 7th house setting, is Rahu in the 11th. Moving on to the third and final chart, Jeffrey Dahmer. If we ask if he's visually beautiful, he's not bad looking for a serial killer. Was he distanced from his mother? This is the oh my god point. This is the thing that really defines Jeffrey Dahmer, is the distanced mother, the missing parental affection, and especially the missing maternal affection. What's going on in his chart is really that his 4th house has the debilitated 6th Lord Jupiter. So that debilitated 6th Lord in the 4th house with the 4th Lord is really wrecking it. Why? Because his moon in the 7th house is a Revati moon. That's the combo. A Revati moon is very susceptible to the quality of its parenting. That's the nature of Revati. The indication about his parenting is that his mother has severe problems because both the 4th Lord and the 4th house have debilitated Jupiter in contact with them, and the moon as Mars in contact with it. If we say, did you have prosperous partnerships, he would probably answer no. And really the problem is the 7th Lord is staying in the 7th house. If the 7th Lord doesn't leave the 7th house, how does it form partnerships? By staying in the 7th house, what does it do? It causes a malefic planet to influence the moon. And what is the nature of that malefic planet? It's Mars in Aries, and what nakshatra? It's in Uttara Bhadrapada. What is Mars in Uttara Bhadrapada all about? Well, from my nakshatra report, which is a new report that I offer, you can get a link to it below. You can get your own nakshatra report. It explains his Mars in Uttara Bhadrapada as an indication of dissatisfaction with conventional pleasures, not being able to find happiness in regular things, and feeling of anger about being unhappy. That's what's really affecting his moon. And then the very interesting thing with him is that he's obsessed with death. And when we ask him if he needs newness, remember this question comes from the clash of the cyclicity of the moon versus the finality of the 7th house. And if does he need newness, he says, I need endings. I'm obsessed with death. And if you look at his 1st Lord is in the 8th house, which is very connected with death. And again, look at the nakshatra of that 1st Lord. It's in Kritika as Venus. So what does Venus in Kritika represent according to the nakshatra report that I offer? It represents that you probably like art and you might be good at art, but your relationships of love are very challenged. There's a Kritika is an axe, and it's a blade, and Venus is love. So the two symbols don't go well together, but unfortunately these two symbols are so vivid for Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibal, the homosexual cannibal rapist. Besides that, for Jeffrey Dahmer to really understand him, it's quite important to bear in mind what Rahu is like when it's in Uttara Phalguni. According to my nakshatra report, Rahu in Uttara Phalguni signifies unusual projects and partnerships and often voracious needs. If you combine all those things, it really defines Dahmer well. And really the key thing with this chart is the debilitated Jupiter. The debilitated Jupiter in the house of the mother with the Lord of the mother, screwing up everything else because of the dependency upon his mother because of having the moon in Revati. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. In this video, we'll discuss what the moon symbolizes in the 8th house, and we will begin by making sure we understand what the 8th house symbolizes. So here you can see what it is physically. Literally, it's the area of the sky that's immediately above the western horizon. And that is the reason why it symbolizes everything that it symbolizes. The area of sky that's above the horizon is the area that contains the erosive weather. And so it symbolizes things that will erode or detract from the horizon below it. The symbolism of the western horizon derives from the fact that the sun sets there. And so the 8th house fundamentally symbolizes the erosion of the west, or in other words, the erosion of the sunset. Sunset particularly symbolizes two things: disappearance and other people. Disappearance is obvious. Other people is because the sun also symbolizes self, the central focus point. And so when it disappears, it means not the self, the other people. So since sunset represents disappearance and other people, and since the sky that's immediately above the western horizon is erosive of those themes, that's where we get the 8th house themes from. For example, the 8th is the house of mysticism, because it's erosive of disappearance, it's anti-disappearance. It's taking invisible things and making them known or bringing them into view. So this is why the 8th house has everything to do with occult, astrology, psychology, psychicness, intuition, all that kind of stuff. The 8th is also the house of insight, and that's just the other side of the same coin of mysticism. Insight, the ability to see things which are hidden, the ability to see things which are difficult to know. So this is why it's the house for analyzing things, analytics, researching things, discovering things, inquiring into the unknown. Also, disappearance means death. And so the 8th house being erosive of disappearance means that it's also erosive of death. This is why it's the house of life force, or Ayushpav. So it's the source of vitality, and this is why it has to do with sex and reproduction, because that's the source of life, right? That's the way you defeat death, is by having new life. However, the 8th house isn't really famous as the anti-death house, is it? It's more famous as the death house. And the reason for that is, although the 8th house symbolizes vitality and the reproduction and the forces that work against death, the planet that's entering into the 8th house is going to be disappearing, both by the fact that soon it's going to go over the western horizon, and also by the fact that the 8th house, by its angle to our eye, is very difficult to see. This is when you get blinded by the sun, when it's in the 8th or the 12th. So, although the 8th house represents anti-deaths, usually when we put a planet in it, the planet's symbolism sort of disappear. To make sure that we have a complete understanding of the 8th house, let's also look at this concept that the sunset signifies other people. So therefore, the 8th house is about erosion of other people, or what we extract from other people. That's why it's the house of personal gains. And gaining things or being given things by other people. So like inheritances, gifts, donations, or just the ability to earn or extract money from others, like salespeople can do. Also, the 8th house has a very clear character of being individualistic or not really cooperating with the group. Now that is what we need to know about the 8th house. Let's do a similar analysis for the moon so that we're totally equipped to understand the moon in the 8th house. The moon, when you think about what it literally is it's a really bright thing that comes out at night. And hence it's a very dichotomous or dipolar thing, because it's bright, but you only see it at night. Because of this dichotomy that's inherent in the moon's nature, which is even reflected in its shape constantly changing, it therefore represents fluctuation, fluidity, cyclicity, and rhythm. Because of it being bright, it represents beauty and things that attract your eye and hold your attention. Because of it being unseen, it has to do with private things. So that means it has to do with shyness and domestic things, and it also means that it has to do with invisible things like the occult. What do we mean by the unknown, the occult, the unseen thing? That's the inner dimension of things. This is why the moon symbolizes the inner dimension of self, which is the mind. The mind is the sense or the tool by which we experience emotions. And emotions are the result of our desires being fulfilled or unfulfilled. And desires are the result of our opinions about what's desirable and what's undesirable. So the moon symbolizes our subjectivity and our bias that forms our opinions, which motivate our desires and therefore produce our emotions, all of which is experienced and subsumed in this one simple word, mind. Furthermore, because the moon is internal, it represents the internal gender, which is female. So the moon is feminine. And because it's bright like the sun, it's like the sun of the night. So it represents authority, the thing that commands you and demands your attention. But it's female authority, so that's why it's the mother figure. Now that we clearly know what the 8th house represents and what the moon represents, we can dive into exploring what the moon in the 8th house signifies. All that we have to do is look for things about the moon that directly have something to do with stuff about the 8th house. You may have already noticed this one. The moon has to do with internal, so unseen things. And the 8th house is great with that because it has to do with bringing invisible things to light. So the moon is all about the unseen and the 8th house is all about the occult. And that's a very good combination. If you want to understand the moon in the 8th house, you just have to think about the fact that the moon and the 8th house both have to do with occult, unknown, internal, psychological, mysterious things. Another thing that you should realize is that the 8th house has to do with sex. And what does that have to do with the moon? The moon has to do with desire. Right? It's about the mind, which is based on emotion, which is based on desire. So that's another thing where the moon and the 8th house are very synergistic. They work well together. If you want to understand the moon in the 8th house, you just have to imagine the ramifications of that synergy between desire and sexuality. The third and final important thing about the moon in the 8th house is that the moon is very domestic, but the 8th house is very defiant. So in other words, the moon is sort of compliant and cooperative, but the 8th house is sort of defiant and uncooperative. And so to understand the moon in the 8th house, you just have to imagine and envision the ramifications of that disharmony. So let me give you some concrete suggestions about how to imagine these things. For example, the moon being unseen and the 8th house being occult. If you have the moon in the 8th house, therefore, expect the native to be an esoteric type of individual. Some type of esotericism will be their forte or be what their minds get attracted to naturally. Probably the occult or something cosmic or something spiritual. Maybe psychological, something like that. On the topic of the moon being desire and the 8th house being sex, what's the implication of that? This individual is sexual, and lust is a synonym for ambition. So these individuals are ambitious, and also sexual is a synonym for sexy, which is a synonym for charismatic. So expect moon in the 8th house people to be sexually active, ambitious, desirous, and charismatic. Convincing, seductive, attractive. Finally, on the issue of the moon being kind of compliant and domestic versus the 8th house being defiant, well, expect these natives to be rebellious and a bit uncooperative. Let me give you some names of well-known people who have the moon in the 8th house in the correct system. So in other words, in the system which I recommend, in a whole sign house system using tropical signs. With verified birth times, because that's important when you're giving examples for houses. So, Anton LaVey, Osho, aka Bhagwan Rajneesh, Carl Sagan, Steve Jobs, O.J. Simpson, and Benito Mussolini. Let's look at 3 of these very carefully. We definitely want to look at Osho, because he's such a great example of the moon in the 8th house. Take a look at his chart. It's not just the moon in the 8th house, it's like everything in the 8th house. So we don't really even have to point out any specific thing. He's just such an 8th house heavy person, and hence he really is a good example of the effects of the 8th house with the moon in it. So he's the sex guru, and he's the sex guru. There you go. That sums up a lot. That sums up the whole thing of everything that we just said about what the moon in the 8th house should represent. A second example that's really, really, really archetypical is Anton LaVey, the defiant Satanist, occultist. Now, his 8th house isn't packed up like Osho's, but look what is going on with him. His first lord is in the 12th house, so his focus is on spiritual or occult or mysterious things. He has Mercury with very close to Rahu, so his intellect is not going to function in a normal way. That Mercury is the lord of his 5th house, so it's forming a Raj Yoga with Rahu, along with Venus, which is the lord of the 9th, forming another Raj Yoga with Rahu. So he has a very, very uniquely strong intellect for weird stuff. Rahu indicating weirdness. But the real kicker is, look at what is packed up in his chart. Most of the focus is on his 4th house, and then his 12th house by virtue of the first lord being there, and then his 8th house by virtue of the moon being there. So look at the trine that's formed in the houses of spirituality, 4, 8, and 12. Thirdly, let's also look at Carl Sagan's chart. Carl Sagan isn't a Rajneesh nor an Anton LaVey, but he's super cosmic. He's the man behind the television series Cosmos. He's the scientist who was attractive to the public. So there you can see how that is sort of sexy or ambitious or charismatic. And you can see how his intellect is really focused towards research and understanding the unknown. And you can see how he's actually defiant, both of the scientific community in terms of how he kind of bridged out from the typical stuffiness of it, and defiant in terms of the superstitions and the common ways of thinking, wanting to bring scientific thought processes into the home. So take a look at his chart. The key thing in his chart is the house exchange between 5 and 7. By virtue of Mercury, the 5th lord, being in the 7th house, and Mars, the 7th lord, being in the 5th house. What that does, as you can see, it's mostly his 7th house which is packed, which is why he's so relatable and why he can communicate with people very well. But you can see how now this, by virtue of this house exchange, all of that 7th houseness is tied up to his house of intellect in Raja Yoga, which makes it very successful. Moreover, his 9th lord is in Raja Yoga in the 10th house, making him very successful and powerful. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. To understand the moon in the 9th house, first understand the 9th house. Here's the 9th house. It's the area of sky that is just to the west of what's directly over our heads. And that is the reason why the 9th house symbolizes whatever it symbolizes. Above us symbolizes our external actions, our active life, and to the west signifies other people. So therefore the 9th house basically symbolizes our actions pertaining to other people, or the way we affect others. This has two primary implications: our values and our integrity. What we believe is the right way to act, and our ability to act the right way. So this is why the 9th house is the house of philosophy, and that encompasses all sorts of words like religion, ethics, morals, and so on. The 9th house is also the house of education, because education is the way that we receive philosophy. Education is the way that we receive morals, ethics, etc. And the 9th house is the house of educators, teachers, parents, family, elders, gurus, priests. Also, the ninth is the house of good deeds. That's the basis of what it is, really. The philosophy is the conception of the good deeds. The good deeds is the action. So how we act towards others, whether we are proper or improper in our actions. That's the subject of the ninth house. So you find a person being dharmic or responsible. And you find a person being generous or charitable. Those traits are of a positive ninth house. Good deeds create good success. If you do things right, you succeed. If you do things good, you get good results. And so the ninth house not only represents good deeds, it also represents good results. That's why it's the house of prosperity and fortune. Now, to understand the moon in the ninth house, the next thing we need to do is understand the moon. The moon is a bright planet that comes out at night. Hence, it's dichotomous because it's both bright and dark. And so it represents that kind of dichotomy, fluctuation, cyclicity, a change of state, not being only one thing, being two things at once, etc. Because the moon is bright, it represents beautiful things, attractive things, things that capture your eye. But because the moon is associated with night, it symbolizes the unseen things. So it's a private planet, which is shy, domestic, or has to do with things that are occult or hidden. Because of that, it has to do with internal things. And this is why it represents the mind, because the mind is the internal aspect of the person. So the mind is a tool for experiencing emotions. It's the sense for emotions. Emotions are a result of desire, whether or not we get what we want. Desire is an outcome of opinion, what we think is good and what we think is bad. And so the moon, by saying that the moon symbolizes the mind, it's a nice little capsule for saying all those things. The moon represents subjectivity. The moon represents bias. The moon represents opinion. The moon represents desires, desirousness. It represents emotion. Another ramification of being internal is that it's the internal gender. So the moon represents femininity and female things. And that has a ramification on the brightness of the moon. Since the moon is bright, it should represent authority. But since it's night, it represents female. So you put two and two together, and it represents female authority, like queens, mothers, and so on. Now that we are up to speed on what the moon symbolizes and what the ninth house symbolizes, it's not that difficult to explain what the moon symbolizes when it's in the ninth house. All that we have to do is look for things that are very obviously in common or in contrast between the planet and the house that it occupies. For example, the moon represents the mother, the ninth house represents parents. And so the moon in the ninth house represents having good parents, or at least having the outcome of good parents. Being well raised, so it means having integrity, having ethics, having morals, etc. The moon symbolizes the mind, and the ninth house symbolizes education. So the moon is the planet of opinions, and the ninth house is about the informing or development of opinions. So the moon in the ninth house represents being well educated, well informed. So we find intelligent people or philosophical people associated with moon in ninth house. Finally, the moon symbolizes prosperity, and so did the ninth house. Why did the moon symbolize prosperity? Because it's female. So femininity is productive and fertile. And so the moon in the ninth house represents prosperity, which means wealth, which also means creativity or fertility. Now let's look at three known people, well-known people who have the moon in the ninth house with confirmed birth times, and we will do this with the whole sign house system and tropical signs. First of all, Sir Emmanuel, and I recommend that people learning astrology use a chart like this one for study because it's very obvious and clear. This is very, very obviously a nun's chart. So from many things we can see that she's very spiritual. For example, the moon in the ninth house is also the eighth lord. So the eighth lord in the ninth house tends to bring spirituality into one's morality and religious outlook. The ninth lord and the 10th lord are together in the 12th house. So she has the 9th and the 10th lord forming a Raja Yoga in her 12th house. The 12th house is very important for spirituality. And she has Jupiter alone in the 10th house. So she has not one, but three very big signatures of a spiritual person. In addition, a nun is not just spiritual, but a nun is very celibate or renunciative. So the signs of that in her chart are also quite clear. The 12th Lord is in the 11th house with the 11th Lord. The 11th house is all kinds of pleasures and enjoyment, but it's connected to the 12th house, so it becomes reduced. Furthermore, her 7th Lord is in the 12th house, reducing sexual activity and marriage. And her 2nd Lord is debilitated in the 5th house, aspecting the 7th. So that would get rid of family and kids. So, Sister Emmanuel, as far as the textbook interpretation of Moon in the 9th house, she looks a lot like the first two. She's very, very philosophical, religious. She's very, very intelligent. She's an author. But she doesn't look like the third one. She's not very fertile. She's not very creative and opulent and attractive like that. So that's why. A very, very important thing not to overlook, which is very easy to not overlook, is Ketu in her 1st house. So that is very obviously a spiritual signature. But what's particularly interesting about this is you might look to see how close it is to the ascendant. Her ascendant is at 6 degrees and her Ketu is at 26 degrees. So you might think it's not particularly effective in the 1st house. That's kind of the only trick. The only unusual thing that's in her chart is that her main planets are not really lining up with the ascendant, but they're exactly lining up with the moon. So remember that. Her moon is at 27 degrees and the Ketu is at 26 degrees, which is putting her Ketu exactly in trine to her 9th house moon, which is giving it a very spiritual slant on the philosophical religious nature of the moon. Now let's compare Sister Emmanuel with another moon in the 9th house native, Jack Black. Jack Black's whole appeal is his intelligent integrity and his sincerity. That's what Jack Black is. That's why he's unique, because he doesn't try to imitate anybody else and he's just himself and he's just raw. So you could see the sincerity, the integrity of the moon in the 9th house very clearly in him. You can also see the intelligence of the moon in the 9th house. Like he talks about sophisticated, significant things like politics and social issues, even though they're so simple and straightforward. But most of all, most obvious with Jack Black is that he's an artist and an entertainer, quite different than Sister Emmanuel. Why is it so? His 11th Lord, Venus, is in the 1st house on the ascendant. Regarding his moon in the 9th house, you'll notice that it's very, very tight with Rahu. And if you think about Jack Black's integrity and philosophy and so forth, he's not Sister Emmanuel, he's not Catholic, he's not religious. He has a boisterous, outgoing, unreserved, not conventionally religious integrity and philosophy and morality. And that's very well expressed in that tight conjunction between Rahu and the moon. It also explains many other things about his character and his body. Finally, a third person with the moon in the 9th house is Aretha Franklin. Integrity is a very big thing for Aretha, respect. But again, like Jack Black, mostly it's the third in her case, the thing about being artistic and creative and fertile. Why is that for her? Well, she has a house exchange between the 5th and the 8th houses. So here comes the fertility, here comes the sensuality, here comes the art. But what really makes this special is that her 8th and her 5th lords are special planets in terms of the other houses that they rule. Her 8th lord is also the 11th lord. Just like Jack Black had to have the 11th lord on the ascendant, the 11th lord has to be active and dominant in an entertainer's chart. So sure enough, she has the house exchange between the 5th and 8th, where the 8th lord is the 11th lord, and it's exactly in the 5th house, meaning it's right on the ascendant degree in the 5th house, and it's exactly conjoined Ketu, meaning it's super intensified, which means that it exactly aspects Rahu, which is exactly in the 11th house. So she has a huge 5-11 axis, with the 11th Lord, which is really, really important for an artist and a musician especially. Furthermore, the 5th Lord exchanges with the 8th Lord. Right? The 8th Lord is also the 11th. The 5th Lord is also the 2nd. And the 2nd Lord has to do with voice. And this 2nd Lord is exactly in the 8th house with the 1st Lord, exactly aspecting the 2nd house. So while Sister Emmanuel's chart was very good in general for anybody studying astrology, just because it's so clear and simple, Aretha Franklin's chart is a very good chart to have on hand when you're learning, just to show you the importance of degrees compared to the ascendant degree. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. If you want to understand the moon in the 10th house, I suggest brushing up on what the 10th house symbolizes and what the moon symbolizes, because then you'll be able to interpret their combination with much greater ease. Starting with the 10th house, here it is. 10th house is anchored to the part of the sky which is up over your head. And that is the root of everything that it symbolizes. It's the open sky. Therefore, it symbolizes things which are very, very visible. This is why it's the house of the extraverse. Not the internal aspects of reality, the external aspects of reality. So it's all about society, the visible world, public. And that, in turn, is why it is the house of fame. So it has to do with what we do in the world, aka our career, how much we achieve here in the world, aka our status or success, aka fame. And this is why it's the house of influence, power, authority. How much can you control that world out there? The open sky is also a very windy place, and it's not very solid. So the 10th house signifies movement, travel, change. It's not rooted and it's not stable. So it's a house of instability, where things get dispersed, spread out, or where they evaporate. Well, that's the 10th house. Now, how about the moon? The most obvious thing about the moon is that it's the brightest thing in the sky at night. So it's bright at night, which means that it has this dichotomy between being both bright and dark. And so the moon represents bipolarity or dichotomy, cyclicity, rhythmicness, change, fluidity. Since it's bright, it represents beautiful things, things that catch our eye. Since it's night, it represents unseen things. So it's all about privacy, private things, shyness, keeping things unseen, things that are inside the home, unseen by the public, domestic things, and also mysterious things, esoteric things, occult things. Now, since it's about the occult or the internal world, it's therefore about the internal part of ourself, which is the mind. Mind is a word we use for the part of the self that experiences emotions. Emotions are based on desires. Whether or not you get what you want makes you either happy or sad. Desires are based on opinion, what you want and what you don't want. So the moon, by symbolizing the mind, symbolizes all of these things. Opinion, subjectivity, bias, which leads to desire, which leads to emotion. Also, since the moon represents internal things, it represents the internal gender, which is the feminine gender. And now, taking that back to the moon being bright, it's very dominant in the sky at night. It represents authority, but it's also internal and feminine. So it represents feminine authority, the archetype of which is the mother. Now I believe we're ready to talk about the moon in the 10th house without getting too confused. What may have caught your mind and jumped out to you already, because it's pretty obvious, is the dichotomy between the moon being internal, the 10th house being external. So there's a clash between the planet of privacy versus the house of publicity. So generally speaking, we should expect negative results from clashes in symbolism. But I want to show you an interesting principle, an important principle. This is the principle of the importance of accumulation of synergy. If all of the synergy between the planet and the house is positive except for one, then that one which is negative or clashing tends to get away from being negative. So let's hold off on interpreting this one. And let's see what else there is about the moon and the 10th house. Let's see if it's all clashes or if there may be some positivity to it. And also, let's think about this internal versus external. Another way of saying this is it's female versus male. But remember, the archetype male for the 10th house is father. The archetype female for the moon is mother. So it also is translating to a clash of the symbolism of mother versus father, but that's not much of a clash, is it? Because they're both parents. So the moon represents authority, and the 10th house represents authority. Another thing is that the moon represents beauty, and the 10th house represents fame. Remember, why is it that the moon represents beauty? It's because it's very bright, and bright things catch your eye. So it's the same thing as fame, being noticeable, being looked at, being seen. And finally, another thing to take into account is that the moon is a change or a fluxy planet. And that goes very well with the 10th house, which is a movement house. It's a windy house. So now let's go back and give some interpretations for these basic signatures that we found, these fingerprints that we found of the symbolism. Let's think now about this difficult one of the privacy of the moon clashing with the publicity of the 10th house. The expected result from this is called Sat Priya Kara. Very, very interesting. It means that they do good. It's the symbolism of the mother acting in the father's role. The symbolism of the internally sensitive person acting is an externally active person. So what kind of deeds will they do? They'll do motherish deeds. They'll do kind deeds. So when people have the moon in the 10th house, one of their expected characteristics is Sat Priya Kara. They do things which a saint would approve of. Literally what the phrase means. They do things that are kind and generous and loving. Do they have a problem with expressing themselves and being authoritative? Not really. But why not? We have a clash between internalism and externalism. It's because we don't have a clash on authority, which is the next principle. The moon represents authority and the 10th house represents authority. So we aren't going to interpret the previous thing to mean that they're weak. Instead, we're going to say that they're jayit. They tend to win. They tend to succeed. They tend to be better than others. Now, how about this third principle of the moon being the planet of beauty and the 10th house being the house of fame? So both of them are attractive and beautiful. The effect of this is Shubhakrit. They do things well. They do things beautifully. And people look at their deeds. People look at what they do. They're known. Moon in the 10th house symbolizes somebody who appears nicely. They look well. They express well. They do things well. Beautifully. They're expert in how they do things. They do things with refinement. The final principle is the planet of change in the house of movement. Siddharamba. It means that they make changes. Able to be different. They're able to set trends. They set new things in motion. Invent new things. They come up with new ideas. Let's look at some well-known people with confirmed birth times who have the moon in the 10th house using tropical signs and the whole sign house system. Bill Gates, Salvador Dali, Frida Kahlo, Angelina Jolie, Edgar Cayce, Ramana Maharshi, Swami Vivekananda, L. Ron Hubbard, Charles Manson, and Bernard Madoff. Bill Gates really shows the inventiveness, Siddharamba. Also, he's known controversially, perhaps, but he's known as a very charitable person, gives a lot of money away. So that exemplifies the first principle that we looked at very strongly. Then you have Dali, Kahlo, great painters. So here's how you have doing things well. Very expert or refined in how they do things. They bring beauty into the 10th house, bring beauty out to the world. Angelina Jolie could be considered in the same group because she's physically beautiful and also she's an artist, actress. She's bringing emotions, etc. out. And then we have a group of 4 kind of occultists: Edgar Cayce, Ramana Maharshi, Swami Vivekananda, L. Ron Hubbard. So here you also can see the effect of taking the internal planet and putting in the external house, putting the occult planet in the house of exposure. Exposed things are revealed. Their secrets, the esoteric, is revealed through these people. Also, this shows a very literal aspect of the first principle, Sat Priya Kara, which literally meant they do things that sadhus do. They do things that saints do. But then you have 2 people who are like the opposite, Charles Manson and Bernie Madoff, 2 criminals. That makes you wonder. They did things that are approved by sadhus. They did kind deeds. So let's take a look at one chart of each type of these persons. Let's look at Frida Kahlo for an artist, Ramana Maharshi for the occultist, spiritualist, and Charles Manson for the criminal. Let's start with Frida Kahlo. She really, really exemplified the ability to bring beauty and fame out from the moon. Why is it? How come Ramana Maharshi wasn't an artist? Well, Frida Kahlo has the moon in Taurus in the 10th house. So it's bringing out the artistic creativity. Furthermore, she has Venus in the 11th house. The 11th house is for the expression of beauty, the showing of art. And Venus is the planet of beauty and art. Not only that, but Venus is the 3rd lord in the 11th house, which means the ability to create art using the hands. And not only that, but it's in the 3rd sign. So again, the ability to create art using hands. On top of that, even still, 11th lord is dominant because it's in the 1st house. 11th house is a huge focal point in this chart. So we have a lot of what we need in terms of the astrological DNA code to get a great artist. The 3rd lord in the 11th house in the 3rd sign as Venus. But we're missing the 5th lord. So what's going on with the 5th lord? Well, the 5th lord is exalted in Raja Yoga. So that does explain why Frida Kahlo is a person whose moon in the 10th house is in the context of somebody who becomes an artist. Let's look at Ramana Maharshi. Ramana Maharshi is more exemplifying potential of the moon in the 10th house to make you behave like a saint. So his moon in the 10th house is in Cancer. Look at what it's with. It's with Ketu. Ketu is the single most spiritualizing factor in astrology. So basically speaking, Frida Kahlo's chart is contextually very artistic as the moon in the 10th house. Ramana Maharshi's chart is contextually very spiritual and has the moon in the 10th house. That's why the moon in the 10th house supports being an artist for Frida Kahlo and supports being spiritualist or an occultist for Ramana Maharshi. Now, how about Charles Manson? How does it support being a criminal and a murderer? Well, his moon is exactly Rahu. That is a signature that we very often find in criminals. Also, it is conjoined Saturn in Saturn's sign with Rahu. So that means that it's an inimical dignity. It's a negative dignity. Here, Charles Manson's moon in the 10th house with Ramana Maharshi and with Frida Kahlo using just the most simplest basic principles of astrology like dignity. Rita Kahlo's is exalted. And Maharshi's is domicile. Charles Manson's is inimical. It's in an enemy's sign. A very strong enemy. Just using that basic principle, you wouldn't expect the same kind of results in these three charts, would you? Then getting a little more sophisticated, you can see that it's with Saturn and exactly with Rahu. So it's going to be destabilized. Yes, he tried to be an artist. Yes, he made big changes in the world. Yes, he was a trendsetter, but mostly he's a very unstable person. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. Understanding the moon in the 11th house begins by understanding the moon and the 11th house. So let's review real quick. Here's the 11th house. It's the area of sky, and that's overhead, but to the east. And that's why it signifies what it signifies. Being overhead, it signifies public, social things, external things. And being to the east, it indicates how those external things affect us or how we benefit from it. So you could summarize everything about the 11th house by saying it's the benefits that we get from society. We can categorize these into two types of benefits, social and cultural. So now we can understand why the 11th is the house of friends. So how we benefit socially from society is there's people that we can play with. There's people that we can do stuff with. And these friendships don't just benefit us recreationally, but also financially. So it's also the house of contacts and networks. And this is why it's the house of income, profits, assets, because the networks that we have, the contacts that we have increase our access to markets and resources. Culturally speaking, the 11th is the house of arts because that's what we benefit from in society. There's movie theaters, there's concert halls, there's museums, there's libraries, there's restaurants. So the 11th house has to do with the arts and entertainment. It also has to do with talent, which is the stuff that populates the theaters and populates the museums and populates the restaurants. So talent, taste, refinement, the ability to enjoy what's in the museum, and pleasure in general, just enjoyment in general. So this is a good, very thorough yet very quick summary of everything that the 11th house is all about. Let's have a look at the moon now. Essentially, the moon is the brightest thing at night, and therefore it's kind of a dichotomy in that you don't really see it during the day too much, but you see it at night, yet it's very, very bright. So it represents bipolarity or kind of split personality. That's why it's the planet for changeableness or uncertainty, fluidity, fluctuation, and cycle. And because it's so bright, it is certainly very attractive. It attracts the eye. Therefore, it symbolizes beauty. And because it only shows its brightness at night, it's therefore associated with the unseen half of the day. So it has to do with private, unseen things, internal things, domestic things, occult things, hidden things, secret things. This also means it has to do with the internal part of the self. This is why it symbolizes the mind. And what is the mind? The mind is the tool that we use to experience emotions. Emotions are based on desires, what we want and what we don't want. Desires are based upon opinions, what we think is good and what we think is bad. So the moon represents opinion, which results in desire, which results in emotion, all of which is summarized in the term mind. Also, the moon being internal represents the internal gender, which is the feminine gender. So the moon is a feminine planet. And also, since it's a bright feminine planet, it represents authority in a female way. Feminine authority, mother figures. Now that's everything important to know about the moon. And now that we know about both the moon and the 11th house, we're ready to look at how we should interpret the moon when it's in the 11th house. As always, you look for a spot where something about the planet has something directly to do with something about the house. So for example, the moon is the planet of desire, and the 11th is the house of pleasure. So if you put the moon in the 11th house, it gets along with the 11th house. And so the interpretation of the moon in the 11th house is what we would call bhafayu. It means lively. They're alive. They're eager. They're ambitious and they're healthy. They're invigorated. They're ready to enjoy. They have a lust for life. Also, the moon being the planet of desire has a lot to do with the 11th house being the house of profit. And so we describe the moon in the 11th house as Dhana and Tanaya. Dhana means wealthy, productive. What I want gets along well with what I get. So the moon in the 11th house signifies the ability to get what you want. So wealth, productivity, the ability to produce, Tanaya, creativity, fertility. The moon being so bright is the planet of beauty, and the 11th is the house of arts. So that's also really synergistic. Hence, the moon in the 11th house signifies manasvi, which means a refined person, a person with good tastes, an intelligent person, a sophisticated person, a high-class person, a person who knows beauty and knows how to be beautiful. Finally, one interesting thing about the moon and the 11th house, which isn't quite on the same page, the moon is an authority figure, and the 11th house is about peers, friends. So that's sort of not getting along, but it's sitting in the context of all these other ways in which the moon does get along with the 11th house. So it's not going to produce an entirely bad result. Also, the moon is an authority, but a feminine authority. So it's not entirely antithetical to peers and cooperation. But what you find with the moon in the 11th house is prityayasaha. The person tends to acquire followers rather than friends. They tend to be leaders, and they don't really sit on the same level with their friends. They are kind of above. They become the leader figure in their group. Now let's put some faces and names on the moon in the 11th house and see if some of these interpretations can come to life and become a little bit more tangible, make more clear sense to us. Kamala Harris has the moon in the 11th. So does John Lennon, Mahatma Gandhi, LeBron James, Martin Luther King, and Agatha Christie. Now, all of these people actually really well illustrate all of these aspects that we mentioned for the moon in the 11th house. But if we could pick out one archetype for each of these four interpretations, I would say Kamala Harris. Let's use Kamala Harris as an example of a person who's very ambitious. She's going to become a vice president of the United States as a woman in a country which hasn't really politically accepted women very well. I would say we could use John Lennon as an example of the creative, wealthy person, and Agatha Christie for the refined, intelligent person, and Martin Luther King for the example of a leader. Now, taking a close look at Kamala Harris, her moon in the 11th house is in Aries. That alone is enough to explain the difference, but there's, of course, more than that in this chart. Another important thing will become clear if you look at the aspects that this moon receives. First of all, it's getting aspected by Saturn from a great dignity in its own sign, Aquarius, in a great house, the 9th house, as the 9th lord. So, in and of itself, we might not know what to make of that, except that she's probably got some political ambition, and she's probably got a whole lot of tenacity and strength. But besides this aspect from Saturn, her moon also has the aspect from the 3rd lord, the sun, from the 5th house in Libra. So now again, it's really clarifying political ambition, and it's the 3rd lord, which is the lord of ambitiousness. And then on top of that, she has a significant aspect from her 6th lord, Mars, from the 3rd house. The 3rd house is the house of ambition. Mars is the planet of ambition, and the 6th lord is a lot of political power and ambition to fight. So taking all these three aspects to her moon together, and considering the fact that that moon itself was in Aries, it's quite easy to see how she would most of all exemplify this ambitious aspect of the moon in the 11th house, and that ambition would have a political slant to it. Above and beyond all this, she has Rahu exactly on her ascendant, which is fairly important for being a very uncommon person. Now let's take a look at John Lennon and see why he exemplifies the creative type that is possible with the moon in the 11th house. Well, his moon in the 11th is not in Aries, it's in Aquarius, which is an air sign. And following up on that clue, you'll find that not only is his moon in an air sign, but so is his sun, and so is his first lord. The air is the element which is very ingenious and creative in an artistic or sensual sense. It's not really enough to explain why he's an artist, most of all, out of all these things. So look a little further. For artists, we like to see combinations between houses 3, 5, and 11. Most of all, 3 and 11, or 5 and 11, something with 11. So in his case, his 11th lord is in mutual aspect with his third lord. His 11th lord is Saturn, and there it is in Taurus. And his third lord is Mercury, and there it is in Scorpio, exactly opposite to his 11th lord. So there you find the artistic skill. And it does describe John Lennon. He's a folk artist, most of all, not a fine artist. And actually, he's more of a political activist in the role of a musician. And that's really well described by his moon being in Aquarius in the 11th house. Now let's take a look at Agatha Christie. Her moon in the 11th house is in Libra and with Mercury. So Libra is another air sign, so she's going to be an artistic type of 11th house moon. But it's Venus's air sign, so it's more purely artistic than Aquarius. And then it's with Mercury. And we're using her as the example not for artistic so much as refined and highly intelligent. So her moon is in an air sign with Mercury, who's very intelligent, refined, and very good with words. Of course, in case you're one of the few human beings around who doesn't know who Agatha Christie is, she's a prolific, highly successful author. Besides this, her first lord Jupiter is in the 3rd house. Third house being art and talent, but especially writing or manual talent. And finally, her 5th lord, which is the other creative important house, is in the 1st house, dominant in a Raja Yoga by its conjunction with a node. Finally, let's take a look at Martin Luther King and see why he makes such a good example of a leader type of person. And why is it that his moon in the 11th house made a leader, not an author or an artist? Well, his moon in the 11th is in Pisces, which is very interesting. Reverend Martin Luther King, philosophical leader, spiritual leader. And it's with Venus, so maybe he should have been an artist, but actually Venus gives you a lot of power, gives you a lot of charisma and attractiveness. It's an exalted Venus, and what's really going on here is that his first lord, therefore, is in the 11th house, while his 11th lord, Jupiter, is in the 1st house, creating a parivartana between the 11th and 1st, which strengthens the 1st house tremendously, which is what it takes to be a leader. So in other words, his moon is in the 11th house with the 1st lord, while the 11th lord is in the 1st. So all of the nature of the moon in the 11th house is focused towards the 1st, which means being an outstanding person, being an outstanding individual, being a person who's seen more than others. And in support of that, he has a very strong Raja Yoga because his 9th lord, Saturn, is exactly opposite to his 7th lord, Mars. And so this gives a lot of power or influence over the people. So now I think it's clear what the moon in the 11th house represents, and also why different charts of different people would bring out different aspects of what the moon in the 11th house represents.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart,
You can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.
Let's explore the meanings of the moon in the 12th house and have a look at how it actually works in the charts of two interesting and very different people, the rebellious porn star Tracy Lords and the Paramahansa Yogananda. So let's start by remembering what the 12th house represents. Here you can see that the 12th house is the area of sky that's above the eastern horizon. So it symbolizes things which erode whatever the east signifies. So the east is the place of sunrise, which also means that it's the place of manifestation or self. And the 12th house gets all of its meanings from the fact that it is erosive of the sunrise and erosive of the self. This is why the 12th is the house of invisible things. When the sun rises, you can see things clearly. If we're erosive of visibility, then we have an idea of what the 12th house signifies. So it deals with things which can't be seen, things that are abstract, amorphous, untangible, unreal, fantastic, dreamy, spiritual, psychological, occult, and so forth. Another way to say this is it's the house of the unknown, like things that are outside of our vision. Things that are in different rooms, things that are in different countries, things that are far away, things that are alien, things that are foreign. And finally, because it's erosive of the sunrise, it means it's erosive of rising, so it's more towards falling. The 12th house has to do with the decline of things, and hence it has to do with a lowering of energy, decline of profits, the expenditure of things, expense. It's also the house of humility. And we can put this under the category of it being erosive of self. Humility has a lot to do with not showing off. And not showing off has a lot to do with not showing, or keeping yourself separate from others. So the 12th house has the flavor of isolation, separation, humility, quietude, and so forth. It is also the house of enemies, because if it's erosive of self, it represents the people that erode the self, the people that detract from us, people that criticize us, the people that take our stuff. And finally, it's the house of weakness, the decline in the physical body. So it has to do with fatigue and giving up or letting go of things. Now that we've remembered what the 12th house is all about, if we want to know what the moon in the 12th house represents, let's take a quick walk through what the moon represents. The moon is a dichotomous planet. It's very bright, but it's only bright at night. And because of that dichotomy, it represents dichotomy, bipolarity, fluctuation between extremes, the rhythm which comes with fluctuation, and the cyclicity which comes with fluctuation. Because it's bright, it represents things that catch our eye, things that are beautiful, things that are attractive. And because it's only bright at night, it represents nighty things. So it represents things which are not displayed, things which are kept in the dark. Private things. So it's a shy planet, a domestic planet, and it has to do with secret things like occult things and so forth. Since it has to do with the stuff that we don't see, it has to do with the internal part of a person. So the internals of a person is the mind. The moon represents the mind. The mind is a collection of emotions. Emotions are based on desires. Desires are based on opinion. So that's all included in the concept of moon representing the mind. It means it represents emotion, desires, and opinion, and that subjectivity and bias that comes with emotions, desires, and opinions. Also, since it's internal by its nature, it represents internal gender, which is feminine. And also, since it's bright, it represents power and authority. And combining the two, the internal femininity versus the outgoing power, we come to understand why the moon represents the mother figure. It's the feminine authority. Now that we are refreshed about what the moon symbolizes and what the 12th house symbolizes, we're ready to put the two of them together and think about what the moon means when it's in the 12th house. So as you probably noticed, the moon is about internal things, things which are nightish, things which are not seen. And so is the 12th house. So that's going to become a major chord that sounds out when you put the moon in the 12th house. The moon is occulty and secret, and so is the 12th house. It's about invisible things. But you may have noticed that the moon is very bright, but the 12th house is invisible things. And finally, you may have noticed that the moon has really our ambition or motivator in it, because it has our opinions and our desires. But the 12th house is about giving up things, letting go of things, or having weakness or fatigue, not having strong motivation. So these are the three important resonances between the moon and the 12th house, which you'll have to bear in mind when you're trying to visualize the meaning of the moon in the 12th house. Let's explore these three in more detail. So the harmony between the moon being occult and the 12th being invisible means people with the moon in the 12th house, they have strong inclinations towards being spiritual. Maybe that means they're into outer space, or cosmic or far out things, or maybe it means they're into religious things, maybe it means they're into occult things. Or maybe it just means that they're very mysterious, that they're very difficult to understand, they're very deep. The other thing represented by this harmony is that people with the moon in the 12th house are probably very intelligent or perceptive, because they're attuned to things which are normally invisible. They're attuned to things which most people miss. And finally, since they're attuned to things which are usually invisible, then they probably deal with things that most people don't, which can also mean that they probably get into taboo things. They get into areas which are forbidden. Then, on the disharmony between the moon's brightness versus the 12th house invisibility, we can say that people with the moon in the 12th house tend not to be famous. Or maybe we can say that they're infamous. In other words, famous for something which is normally not considered that great. Or maybe we can say that they're unhappy with fame. They don't want fame. Fame is not their motivator. Or we can say that the fame that they have is unusual. It's in unseen areas. So they have like an underground following, or they have a culty kind of a fame. And then the final thing about the moon in the 12th house was another disharmony, that the moon is motivating or invigorating, and the 12th house is fatiguing and demotivating. So when the moon is in the 12th house, people's determination tends to be unsteady. Their desires for things tend to fall off before they get them. So they have inconsistent motivations and desires. Hence, they often go a little bit towards one thing and then lose interest in it and then go towards something else. They change course in life often, change direction often, or we can say that they simply just don't have very strong desires. Here are 6 well-known people with the moon in the 12th house using tropical signs, whole sign houses, and AA rated confirmed birth times. Nicholas Copernicus, Niels Bohr, Elizabeth Taylor, Tracy Lords, Paramahansa Yogananda, and Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant and Yogananda are very obviously spiritualists. Copernicus and Fermi are not spiritualists, but they're extremely smart scientists. And then 3 of the people out of these 6 also really match the taboo-breaking nature of the moon in the 12th house. Copernicus, Tracy Lords, and Elizabeth Taylor, who's like a sexy polyandrous woman. If we look at the issue of how fame works for a person with the moon in the 12th house, Tracy Lords is a good example of someone who's famous for something that most people don't want to be famous for, or most people hide. So it's kind of like infamy. All the other people on this list, except Elizabeth Taylor, are extremely famous, but in very niche or small circles. And then Elizabeth Taylor is the only actual pop star in this list. And she's also the only one out of these people whose first house ascendant is aspected exactly by her first lord. About the motivation and fatigue issue, so people in the 12th house are expected to have unsteady desires. Elizabeth Taylor, very good example of that. She can't keep her desire from one man steady more than a few months. Tracy Lords also big changes, big reversals, big switches in direction. And then Kant and Paramahansa, they're the renunciates, they're the spiritualists, so they show the potential for the moon in the 12th house to indicate no desires. Now, as you can see, it's actually very important not just to rely on one planet in one house or one planet in one sign, but to look at the whole chart. So let's take two of these people and see why they both have moon in the 12th house, yet they're both quite different. So Tracy Lords, one of the most obvious things is that in her chart, all the planets are above ground and none of them are below ground. So that indicates a lot of extroversion or showiness. Then we find that the 5th Lord is in the 7th house with Rahu. So this makes a Raja Yoga in the 7th house. But it's a very interesting Raja Yoga because it's formed by a debilitated Saturn as the 5th Lord. So this shows us some very unusual but powerful sexual behavior. And that debilitated Saturn as the 5th Lord aspects the ascendant very strongly at the same time that Ketu conjoins the ascendant very closely. So that shows us rebelliousness and subversiveness connected to that unusual sexual behavior. Furthermore, the Lord of the 5th house is in the 8th house as the 8th Lord in its own sign, with these very strong masculine planets, including the 11th and 7th Lords. So this chart shows a very sexually powerful, confident, and attractive person, for sure. On top of that, she has Jupiter in the 11th house. Now this indicates that she's a performer because Jupiter is the 3rd Lord. The 3rd Lord in the 11th house indicates a performer. And then on top of that, she has Raja Yoga in the 7th house and she has all her planets above ground. It also shows that she's attractive. Jupiter in the 11th house means you will win people over. And it also means that she'll be successful in her plans and she'll achieve her desires. And also you see that she has Mercury, the 9th Lord, in the 9th house, which indicates that she's intelligent, lucky, and also shows or confirms that she's heterodox, acting with the Saturn debilitated and Ketu influencing the ascendant, having the 12th Lord in the 9th house, shows heterodoxy, doing stuff which is forbidden. Now, in that context, interpret the moon in the 12th house. So then we'll see these three dynamics of the moon in the 12th house and we'll easily be able to pick which one of the possible outcomes is most appropriate to pronounce as the interpretation. For her, it's taboo breaking, cult fame or infamy, and strong course changes, not weak desires. Very strong desires, but big changes and surprises in how she behaves. Now let's compare this chart with Paramahansa Yogananda's. The main thing here is the 9th Lord joins the 1st Lord in the 4th house in Jupiter's sign Sagittarius. So this shows a very moral person who's got morals very deep and holds them very sincerely in their heart. They're very dedicated, devoted to goodness. On top of that, you find he has exalted Saturn compared to lords who has debilitated Saturn. He has exalted Saturn, and that Saturn is exactly in a position, perfectly almost aspect, that 9th Lord and that whole Raja Yoga in the 4th house. So this whole combo of the 9th Lord and the 1st Lord joining in the 4th house in Jupiter's sign with exalted Saturn's aspect shows a person who is very dedicated to self-abnegation for the betterment of others. Now the rest of the chart, it becomes fairly easy to interpret now because this thing is so strong and it sets the tone for everything else. So now when we see Ketu in the 3rd house, we think, that's another sign of reduced desires. When when we see the sun in the 5th house as the 12th lord, then we also see a lack of need to procreate, and rather an aspiration or an intellect for things which are intangible or spiritual. Then on top of that, the moon in the 12th house can show weak desires. But we might think, what about his 8th house? It looks kind of significant. Because like Tracy Lords, he has the 8th lord in the 8th house, and then he has Jupiter, the 7th lord in the 8th house. So certainly Paramahansa Yogananda is not unattractive. He's very attractive and charismatic. But in the context of that immense Raj Yoga in the 4th house with Saturn, exalted Saturn's aspect on it, it's not going to indicate a highly sexual person. Rather, it goes along with the 12th house theme of occult, especially because that Jupiter in the 8th house is an practically exact mutual aspect with the exalted Saturn in the 2nd house, which is the source of all his self-restraint and renunciation. In this context, when you see his moon in the 12th house, possibilities of just a generic moon in the 12th house become obvious. It's not just a generic moon in the 12th house anymore, which could be spiritual or could be taboo. It's definitely spiritual. The moon in the 12th house in this chart is definitely supporting the spirituality of the person. It's really showing a person who's humble. That's another possible permutation of the brightness of the moon contrasting the invisibility of the 12th house, is humility. And then this third thing about the motivating factor of the moon versus the demotivating factor of the 12th house. And in this chart, you would see he has low desires, no material desires.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.